There is a field in the south of England that most people have driven past without stopping. It sits between two low hills that the locals have always called the Sisters, though no official map uses that name. The field has been farmed for centuries. Wheat, then barley, then set aside, then wheat again. The soil is chalk-heavy, and it drains quickly, and in dry summers it bleaches almost white under the sun. And underneath that field, underneath the centuries of ploughing and planting and harvest, underneath the medieval field strips and the Roman agricultural modifications and the Bronze Age cremation deposits, there is something that was not supposed to be there. Something that the archaeologists who found it described, in their cautious and precise professional language, as having no satisfactory parallel in the British prehistoric record. That is an extraordinary statement. Britain has one of the most intensively studied prehistoric landscapes in the world. The island has been occupied by anatomically modern humans for at least 40,000 years, and by earlier hominins for hundreds of thousands of years before that. Its soil has been turned over by amateur metal detectorists and professional excavators and developer-funded evaluation trenches and university research projects for well over 2 centuries. There is almost no category of prehistoric structure or artifact that has not been found somewhere in Britain and described and classified and placed within the established typological frameworks. When a British archaeologist says that something has no satisfactory parallel in the British prehistoric record, they are saying something that has almost never needed to be said. And yet here it is. A field in the south of England. A structure beneath the chalk that does not fit any of the established categories. A thing that is genuinely new, not just in the sense of being newly discovered, but in the deeper sense of being genuinely unlike anything that the long history of British prehistoric archaeology has previously described. This is going to take some time to tell properly. These things always do. Pull the blanket up a little if you need to. Let the day fall away. There is no urgency here. The story has been waiting for a very long time, and it can wait a little longer for you to get comfortable. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it. The discovery began, as so many discoveries in British archaeology begin, with something that was not an archaeological project at all, a drainage improvement scheme. The farmer who worked the field had noticed for years that the northwestern corner of it held water after heavy rain in a way that made cultivation difficult. A waterlogged field corner is not unusual in chalk country, because the chalk aquifer can behave in locally unpredictable ways, and the water that falls on the higher ground to the north has to go somewhere. But this corner had been getting worse over the years, not better, and eventually the farmer applied for a drainage improvement grant through the Rural Development Programme, and a contractor was brought in to cut a new land drain along the western boundary. The contractor's machine, a tracked excavator with a narrow ditching bucket, had been working for about 3 hours when it hit something at approximately 1.5 meters below the modern surface. Not just a stone, though it hit a stone, a surface. A prepared horizontal surface of fitted flat stones that extended, as far as the machine operator could determine without digging further, in both directions along the line of the drain. The operator, who had worked on enough development projects in chalk country to know what medieval masonry and Roman foundations looked like, understood immediately that this was neither. He stopped the machine, called the contractor, and within 20 minutes, someone had called the county archaeologist. The county archaeologist arrived the following morning. She had been in the job for 11 years, and she had dealt with hundreds of accidental discoveries in her county, from Saxon burials turned up by garden landscaping, to Roman coin hoards exposed by rabbit warrens, to Bronze Age cremation urns cracked by deep ploughing. She knew how to assess what she was looking at quickly and accurately, and she knew when what she was looking at was outside her experience. This was outside her experience. The fitted stone surface was not Roman. The fitting technique was not medieval. The stones themselves were not local chalk. They were a type of sarsen, the hard, silicified sandstone that forms naturally in certain areas of southern England, and they had been shaped and fitted with a precision that she associated, in her mind, immediately and unavoidably, with prehistoric construction of the most accomplished kind. But the specific form of the construction, the horizontal fitting, the alignment, the way the stones related to each other, was not anything she could place within the established framework of British prehistoric architecture. She called a colleague at the university. That colleague came out the next day. He looked at what was in the drainage trench, and he said, quietly, and to no one in particular, that this was going to be complicated. And then he made the calls that set in motion the slow, careful, methodologically rigorous process that would eventually produce the findings that have, for the small community of researchers who know about them, rewritten several important chapters of what we thought we understood about prehistoric Britain. The process took years. It is still, in certain respects, ongoing. The full extent of the structure beneath the field has not been determined because the excavation has been conducted in carefully controlled stages, with proper analysis of each phase before the next is opened, and the resources for full excavation have had to be assembled incrementally through a combination of heritage funding and university research grants, and the farmer's own willingness to keep the most affected part of his field out of production. These things take time in the way that serious archaeology always takes time. But what is known, from the stages of excavation that have been completed, is enough to justify the word that the researchers have been cautious about using, but that the evidence increasingly demands. Enough to say that what is beneath that field in the south of England is genuinely, rigorously, scientifically unprecedented. Not the word unprecedented in the loose popular sense that gets applied to any slightly unusual thing. Unprecedented in the specific technical sense that the structure does not conform to any known typology of British prehistoric construction, and that its characteristics require either a significant revision of the established timeline, the acceptance of a degree of complexity in pre-Bronze Age British society that the existing models do not account for. To understand why that matters, you need to understand something about the landscape of prehistoric Britain and how we think about it. The conventional account of prehistoric Britain is one of the most carefully constructed and most intensively evidenced narratives in world archaeology. It has been built over more than 2 centuries of systematic investigation. It rests on an enormous body of excavated and dated material. It has been refined and revised as new techniques and new discoveries have provided new information. And in its current form, it presents a picture of British prehistory that moves through recognizable phases, each with its characteristic material culture and its characteristic social and economic organization, from the first Mesolithic hunter-gatherers through the Neolithic revolution of farming and monument building, through the Bronze Age metalworking societies, through the Iron Age tribal confederacies to the Roman conquest. Within this framework, there is a well-established understanding of what kind of people were building, what kind of things, at what times. The great stone circles and chambered tombs and cursus monuments of the Neolithic are attributed to the farming communities of the 4th and 3rd millennia before the current era. The henges and avenue systems belong to a transitional period between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. The field systems and roundhouses belong to the Bronze and Iron Ages. Everything has its place. Everything has its date range. Everything has its cultural attribution. The structure beneath the chalk field in the south of England does not fit this framework. Not because it is obviously different in some superficial way, but because its dating, when the first reliable dates from organic material found in association with it came back from the laboratory, placed it in a period that the framework does not have a category for, a period before the Neolithic, before the farming revolution, before the monument-building traditions that we associate with the spectacular stone circles of Western Britain, in a period when, according to the established model, the population of Britain consisted of small mobile bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived lightly on the landscape and left almost no permanent material trace. Mesolithic Britain is, in the conventional understanding, a landscape of impermanence. The Mesolithic period, which spans roughly from 10,000 to 4,000 years before the current era in British terms, is characterized in the archaeological record by small sites, temporary camps, worked flint assemblages, occasional structural evidence in the form of post holes and hearth features, but nothing that approaches the scale and permanence and deliberate architectural ambition of the Neolithic monuments. The people of Mesolithic Britain, in the conventional model, were sophisticated and knowledgeable and culturally complex in many ways, but they did not build, they did not construct. They moved through a landscape that they knew intimately, but left largely unmodified in the physical sense. The dates from the Chalkfield site do not fit that picture. The organic material in the soil contexts immediately beneath and adjacent to the stone surface, dated by radiocarbon methods and cross-checked with optically stimulated luminescence dating of the sediment deposits, points to a construction horizon that is solidly, unambiguously Mesolithic. Not early Neolithic, which would still be surprising but would at least be within the range of periods when significant construction is known from Britain, Mesolithic. From a time when the conventional model says the people of this landscape were not building the kind of thing that is sitting under the chalk, the researchers have been careful about their dates. They have sought multiple independent lines of chronological evidence. They have submitted samples to multiple laboratories. They have consulted with specialists in quaternary stratigraphy about whether there are natural processes that could have produced the sediment sequence in ways that might be misleading the dating. They have done the things that careful archaeologists do when they have results that challenge established understanding, because they know that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they are determined that the evidence they present will be robust enough to withstand the scrutiny it will receive. The scrutiny has been intense. The peer review process for the initial publication of the dating evidence was unusually prolonged because the reviewers included specialists who were not immediately willing to accept dates that so fundamentally challenged the established framework. The revisions requested went through multiple rounds. The standard of evidence demanded was higher than what would typically be required for results that confirmed the conventional picture. That disparity is itself revealing about how scientific institutions respond to anomalous findings. But the evidence survived the scrutiny. The dates were confirmed. The structure is what it is, sitting in the Mesolithic where the Mesolithic is not supposed to contain anything like it. What is it, exactly? The physical structure, as excavated so far, consists of three distinct components that the researchers have labeled for convenience as the platform, the approach, and the enclosure. The platform is the fitted stone surface that the drainage contractor first exposed. It covers an area of approximately 240 square meters in the sections excavated to date, though geophysical survey suggests it may extend considerably further. The stones are shaped, not just selected. They have been worked to produce flat upper surfaces and angled lower edges that allow them to lock together in a fashion that provides stability without mortar. The quality of the fitting is, in the assessment of the specialist brought in from a university with expertise in prehistoric stoneworking, consistent with a tradition of skilled practice, not experimental or one-off. The people who fitted these stones had done this kind of work before. They knew what they were doing. The approach is a linear feature extending from the northern edge of the platform. It is defined by two parallel lines of smaller stones, also shaped, set into the ground on edge rather than laid flat. The lines are approximately 2 meters apart, and the feature runs for at least 35 meters in the direction that geophysical survey can resolve before the signal becomes ambiguous. The approach is oriented, within the precision of the measurements that have been made, toward a specific point on the northeastern horizon. The point it is oriented toward is the position of the rising sun at the summer solstice. The enclosure is the feature that has generated the most discussion among the researchers, because it is the feature that most defies easy classification. It is a roughly oval depression, approximately 12 by 8 meters, cut into the chalk below the level of the platform. The cutting is deliberate, not natural. The walls of the depression are vertical and show evidence of being finished, smoothed in a way that natural chalk does not erode. The floor of the depression is covered with a deposit that includes ash, charred plant material, and a remarkable quantity of animal bone from species that included red deer, wild boar, aurochs, and fish. The deposit is stratified in ways that suggest it accumulated over an extended period rather than in a single episode. People were using this space repeatedly, coming back, maintaining whatever relationship with the place they had established. And within that deposit, at a depth and in a context that associates it securely with the primary phase of activity at the site, was found something that no one had anticipated and that no one has yet fully explained. a small carved object, not large enough to be impressive in a physical sense, approximately the size and general shape of a closed human fist, made of antler, which has survived because the alkaline chalk environment was unusually kind to organic material at this depth. Carved with marks that are not random, that show the same kind of internal regularity that the Selkirk researchers in the Canadian context noted in their geometric sequences, that appear to represent something rather than merely decorate something. But what they represent, if that is the right word, is currently unknown. The carved antler object has been studied by specialists in Mesolithic material culture, by specialists in prehistoric symbolic systems, by specialists in comparative world rock art and portable art traditions. None of them has been able to place it within any known British Mesolithic artistic tradition, because the British Mesolithic artistic tradition, as it is currently understood, does not include this kind of formally elaborated carved object. The Mesolithic peoples of Britain produced worked flint, carved bone tools, occasional perforated animal teeth that may have been worn as ornaments. They did not, in the established record, produce the kind of intentionally symbolic carved object that this appears to be. Except, now, they apparently did. The object is currently in secure storage at the university laboratory, where it has been analysed. It will eventually be published in full. The researchers are taking their time because they want the publication to be complete and rigorous and supported by every available line of analytical evidence. They want the isotope analysis that tells them where the deer whose antler was used came from. They want the use-wear analysis that might tell them how the object was handled or carried. They want the comparative study of the marks that is being conducted, slowly and carefully, by the specialist with the most relevant expertise. They are doing this right because they know that the object is potentially one of the most significant items ever recovered from a British Mesolithic site, and they want the case for its significance to be unassailable when it is finally made. The researchers are not the only people who know the site exists. The local planning authority knows. The heritage body knows. The farmer and the contractor and the county archaeologist and the university team and the funding bodies and the peer reviewers and a small number of colleagues who have been consulted in confidence all know. But the formal publication, the moment when the findings enter the public scientific record in a form that the broader scholarly community and eventually the general public can engage with, has not yet happened. The site is real, the dates are real, the carved object is real. But officially, in the sense of the public scientific literature, this chapter of the story has not yet been written. Why not? That is a question worth spending some time with, because the answer reveals something important about how archaeology works, and about why significant discoveries sometimes take a very long time to reach the public awareness that they deserve. The primary reason is the one that the researchers would cite first, and that is genuinely the most important reason, which is that they are not finished. Archaeological publication is a process that requires completion. You do not publish a site when you have found something interesting. You publish a site when you have done the analysis that allows you to say, with appropriate precision and appropriate acknowledgement of uncertainty, what you have found and what it means. The analysis of this site is ongoing. The dating program is complete in its essential outlines, but continues to add detail. The study of the carved object is ongoing. The geophysical survey that might define the full extent of the site is ongoing. The environmental sampling that will tell them about the ecology of the Mesolithic landscape around the site is ongoing. They are not ready to publish because the work is genuinely not done. But there is a second reason, which is less flattering to the institutions involved, and which the researchers would be unlikely to cite in exactly these terms, and that is that what they have found is going to be controversial in ways that require careful preparation. The dating results will be contested. The interpretation of the carved object will be contested. The implications for the conventional understanding of Mesolithic Britain will be contested. These contestations will be legitimate scientific debates, and they will ultimately make the published findings stronger. But they will also be, in some cases, the expression of institutional resistance to findings that challenge established frameworks. And the researchers know this, and they are preparing accordingly, making sure that the evidence is as bulletproof as they can make it before they expose it to the fire. The preparation is wise. The example of other anomalous discoveries in European prehistory is instructive. When the Chauvet Cave in France was announced in 1994, with dates suggesting cave paintings more than 30,000 years old, the initial reaction from parts of the establishment was deep skepticism. The dates were challenged. The interpretation was questioned. Some specialists argued that the paintings were not as old as the dating claimed, or that the style was inconsistent with what the dates implied about the level of artistic development at that period. The debate was intense and not always collegial. Eventually, the Chauvet dates were confirmed and accepted, and the discovery changed the understanding of early European art in fundamental ways. But the process of acceptance took years and required the kind of sustained, rigorous defense that the researchers had not anticipated would be necessary for findings that were simply a true and careful account of what was in the cave. The researchers working on the Chalkfield site are not going to be caught unprepared in the same way. They have seen what happened to other controversial discoveries. They are going to make the case as thoroughly as it is possible to make it before submitting to the scrutiny that is coming. In the meantime, the site sits in the field. The farmer has been patient. He has received some compensation through the heritage funding that supports the excavation, and he has made his peace with the fact that a portion of his farm is effectively a research station for the foreseeable future. He does not, by his own account, find the whole thing particularly interesting from a philosophical or historical perspective. His relationship with the land is practical. He grows things in it. The fact that the people who grew things in it many thousands of years before him apparently did something extraordinary with the stone beneath the soil is not for him a matter of strong feeling in either direction. But for the researchers, it is a matter of very strong feeling indeed. Not the kind of feeling that compromises objectivity, but the kind that sustains the long, painstaking, undramatic work of proper archaeological investigation. The feeling that what is being done here matters. That what is in the chalk under that field matters. That getting the account of it right matters in a way that goes beyond professional obligation and touches something more fundamental about what it means to do work that is accountable to the truth. That feeling is what carries people through years of careful excavation and laboratory analysis and peer review, and the slow institutional processes that govern how knowledge advances in the formal scientific world. It is what makes archaeological research possible at all, because the rewards of the work, in terms of conventional professional incentives, are often insufficient to explain the dedication that serious archaeology requires. The dedication here is very serious, and what it has produced, and what is sitting in secure storage at the university laboratory, and what is documented in the excavation records and the dating reports and the analytical results that are being assembled for publication is going to matter. When it enters the public record, it will change something. What exactly it will change is worth thinking about carefully, because the changes it implies are not all of the same kind. Some of the changes are relatively contained within the specialist literature. New calibration of the Mesolithic cultural sequence in southern Britain. New evidence for the spatial variability of Mesolithic behavior. New data points for the debates about the complexity and permanence of pre-Neolithic settlement patterns. These are important changes within the discipline, but they are the kind of changes that specialists can absorb and integrate without requiring a fundamental rethinking of everything they have understood. But other changes implied by the Chalkfield site go deeper. They imply a rethinking of the relationship between hunter-gatherer societies and permanent architecture, of the relationship between mobility and construction, of what we mean when we say that a society is complex or not complex, of the assumptions we carry about what pre-agricultural people were and were not capable of, in terms of social organization, technical skill, and the investment of collective effort in structures that served purposes beyond immediate survival. These deeper changes are the ones that matter most in the long run, because they are the ones that connect the specific discovery in the south of England to the broader question of what we actually know about the deep human past, and how much of what we think we know is evidence-based, and how much is assumption. The assumption that architecture implies agriculture is deeply embedded in the conventional understanding of human prehistory. The narrative of the Neolithic revolution as the pivot point from simple mobile life to complex settled life is one of the foundational stories of human history, as it is taught in universities and written in textbooks and presented in museums. It is not wrong exactly, in the sense that it is based on real evidence from real sites across multiple continents, but it is a simplification. It smooths over the complexity and variability of real human behavior in favor of a clean narrative of progressive development. And when evidence emerges that does not fit the clean narrative, the response of the clean narrative is initially to resist the evidence rather than revise the narrative. The Chalkfield site is evidence that does not fit the clean narrative. It is not alone in that category. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, the great complex of carved stone pillars that was built by hunter-gatherers approximately 11,000 years ago, and that predates farming in the region, is the most famous example of the same challenge to the same assumption. Göbekli Tepe forced a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between architectural ambition and agricultural society. It showed that complex, large-scale, deliberately designed stone construction was possible and was actually undertaken by people who were not yet farmers. Its discovery and its eventual general acceptance in the 1990s and 2000s changed the field in ways that are still being worked through. The Chalkfield site in Britain raises a similar challenge in a British context. It does not reach the scale of Göbekli Tepe, but it is, arguably, more precisely and more rigorously dated because the British radiocarbon and OSL dating infrastructure is among the best in the world, and the samples from the Chalkfield site have been processed by that infrastructure with a care that is evident in the results. The dates are solid, the challenge to the narrative is real, and in the British context, where the established narrative of the Mesolithic is more deeply entrenched and more professionally important than it might be elsewhere, the challenge will be felt more acutely. There is a great deal of published work that will need to be reconsidered if the Chalkfield site is what it appears to be. Careers were built on understandings that may need revision. Textbooks will need updating. Museum displays will need rethinking. The educational material that has been telling students for decades what Mesolithic Britain was like will need amendment. This is not a comfortable process. It is not comfortable for the people whose work needs revision. It is not comfortable for the institutions whose authority rests in part on the established narratives, but it is the necessary process. It is what science is supposed to do, update its account of the world in response to evidence. The Chalkfield site is evidence, and the updating is coming. The question of where the builders of the Chalkfield site came from, and what cultural tradition they were part of, and what connections they had to other contemporary societies in Britain and beyond, is one that the genetic evidence is beginning to address in ways that add another layer of complexity to the picture. Ancient DNA from British Mesolithic individuals has been recovering in increasing quantity as the techniques for extracting genetic material from ancient bone have improved. The picture that the genetic data paints of the Mesolithic population of Britain is one of deep divergence from the European mainland populations of the same period. The Mesolithic people of Britain belonged, genetically, to a lineage sometimes called Western hunter-gatherers, and they were relatively isolated from the populations that were developing farming in Anatolia and southeastern Europe at the same time. When farming arrived in Britain, as the genetic data now confirms, it came with a largely new population, largely replacing the existing hunter-gatherers rather than intermarrying with them to any significant extent. That replacement means that the people who built the Chalkfield structure are genetically largely absent from the modern British population. Their contribution to the contemporary gene pool is small. They were, in the most literal biological sense, replaced. And this makes the cultural continuity between them and later British prehistoric cultures difficult to trace, because the people who built the Neolithic monuments that followed were, to a significant degree, different people. But the cultural continuity is not the only kind of continuity that matters. The Chalkfield site sits in a landscape that later populations also inhabited and modified and used. The Neolithic and Bronze Age communities that came after the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers walked through the same valleys and looked at the same hills and worked the same chalk soil. Did they know the structure was there? Did they encounter it? Did they incorporate it into their own relationships with the landscape, the way that later peoples everywhere have incorporated older features into their own sense of place and their own ritual geography? The archaeological evidence bearing on this question is ambiguous but suggestive. The stratigraphy above the Mesolithic construction horizon shows traces of later activity. There is a Bronze Age cremation deposit in the general area of the site, which might be coincidental but might also reflect a continued sense that this particular location was significant. There is a cluster of medieval field boundaries that seems to respect the general area of the subsurface feature in ways that the researchers have noted but cannot fully explain. People in subsequent periods may not have known what was beneath the ground, but they may have sensed something about the place. Places carry their histories in ways that are not always fully conscious. This is speculative. The researchers are careful to label it as such. But the question of how later communities related to earlier features, whether they knew or suspected their presence, whether the place retained a sense of significance across the cultural transitions that brought successive populations to the landscape, is not a trivial question. It is one of the central questions in the archaeology of landscape, and the Chalkfield site is a location where that question can now be asked with a specificity and a depth of evidence that most sites do not offer. The specificity comes from the detail of the record. The site has been excavated carefully enough that the stratigraphic relationships between different periods of activity are clear. The environmental sampling program has recovered material that allows reconstruction of the landscape at different moments in the site's history. The combination of good stratigraphy, good dating, and good environmental data is the gold standard of site investigation, and the Chalkfield site has it. What it now needs is the time and the resources to complete the analysis and bring it to publication. That time and those resources are available, though not in unlimited quantities. The heritage funding bodies have committed to the project. The university has allocated research time. The specialist collaborators who are contributing their expertise to different aspects of the analysis are working on their contributions. The publication timeline, while not fixed, is measured in years rather than decades. The site will be fully published. The findings will enter the public record. The challenge to the established narrative will be formally made and formally available for the response it deserves. What comes next after publication is the work of the broader scholarly community. The work of evaluating the evidence, debating the interpretation, conducting the follow-up investigations that the publication will inspire, revising the textbooks and the museum displays and the educational materials. The work of updating the story of British prehistory in the light of what is sitting under the Chalkfield in the south of England. That work will take longer than the excavation and analysis. It always does. The excavation of a site takes months or years. The analysis takes years. The publication takes years more. And the integration of the findings into the broader understanding of the subject, the point at which the discovery genuinely changes the field, takes years beyond that. The full impact of significant archaeological discoveries is often not felt until a generation after the discovery itself. The Chalkfield site has been discovered. The analysis is proceeding. The publication is coming. The impact is waiting to be felt. And in the meantime, the site itself sits in the chalk, patient, as only stone can be patient, waiting for the full attention it has earned. There are other things in Britain that have been waiting for attention of a similar kind. Not waiting because they are undiscovered, but because they are understood within frameworks that may not be adequate to what they represent. One of the most striking is the collection of sites in the Cumbrian landscape of northwest England that has been the subject of a slow-developing, quietly significant research program centered at a university in the region for the past decade and a half. The Cumbrian landscape is famous in British prehistoric archaeology, primarily for one thing, which is the stone axe factories of the Neolithic period. The hard volcanic rock of the Central Lake District, particularly the stone found in the high passes around the Langdale Pikes, was worked into polished stone axes that travelled enormous distances across Britain and Ireland during the Neolithic period. Cumbrian axes have been found in excavations from one end of the island to the other. They are one of the clearest material demonstrations of the long-distance connections that existed between Neolithic communities across the British Isles. They are one of the things that has long made the Neolithic landscape of Britain interesting to archaeologists, because they suggest a degree of connectivity and exchange that challenges the image of small, isolated farming communities living within tight local territories. The research program in Cumbria, however, has been looking at things that predate the axe factories, things that the axe factories and the Neolithic farming communities that used them may have been, in a sense, built on, not literally, but culturally, in the sense of incorporating into their own landscape used traditions that were already present in the Cumbrian hills before the first farmers arrived. What the researchers have found, in a program of survey and limited excavation that has been careful and methodical and underfunded and persistent, is a category of landscape feature that they have termed modified outcrops. These are natural rock outcrops, of which the Lake District has enormous numbers because the landscape is a heavily glaciated one in which bedrock protrudes through the thin soil in thousands of places that show evidence of deliberate human modification. Not construction in the sense of the chalkfield site, not building upward from the surface, but working with the natural rock, shaping and modifying what is already there in ways that serve purposes that the researchers are still working to identify. The modifications range from subtle to substantial. At the subtle end, they include the removal of natural protrusions that would have disrupted an otherwise flat upper surface, producing what appear to be deliberately level platforms on the top of naturally occurring rock outcrops. At the more substantial end, they include the creation of formal enclosures by building up the edges of natural rock platforms with shaped stone and the cutting of channels and basins into the rock surface in patterns that the researchers have shown are consistent with water collection and management, rather than random erosion. Water management in a pre-agricultural context is something that mainstream prehistoric archaeology has rarely had to think about, because the assumption has been that pre-agricultural people did not need to manage water in any planned way. They moved to where the water was rather than modifying the landscape to make water available where they were. But a society that is building permanent structures, as the chalkfield site implies at least some Mesolithic communities were, is also a society that has reason to think about water management. A permanent place of gathering, or ceremony, or whatever the chalkfield structure served, requires a reliable water supply in a way that a temporary camp does not. The basin features on some of the Cumbrian modified outcrops are consistent with the collection of rainwater and its management for use at a specific location. They are located, in several cases, where the surrounding rock surface would funnel rainwater toward the basin. They are deep enough, in some cases, to hold a significant volume of water, and they are associated, at the sites where excavation has been possible, with cultural material that the dating program places in the Mesolithic period. Mesolithic water management in the Lake District. Mesolithic architectural construction in the south of England. These findings are not from the same sites or from connected research programs, but they describe, together, a Mesolithic Britain that is significantly more complex and more deliberate in its relationship to the physical landscape than the conventional account has allowed. They suggest that the hunter-gatherer populations of late Mesolithic Britain were not simply mobile opportunists following the resources of a landscape they did not modify. They were, in at least some cases, people with permanent places and managed environments and constructed spaces and apparently carved symbolic objects. That is a picture of Mesolithic Britain that the discipline is going to have to accommodate. Not easily or quickly, but accommodate. The process of accommodation is already underway, in quiet ways. The chalkfield site has been discussed in specialist seminars under conditions of confidentiality. The Cumbrian modified outcrop research has been published in specialist journals read by the appropriate community of specialists. There are PhD students now writing theses that take as their starting point a more complex view of Mesolithic Britain than their predecessors' theses took. The understanding is evolving, as understandings do, from the inside out, from the specialist community to the broader educated public, from the academic literature to the textbooks and the museum displays, and eventually the popular representations that shape what the general public knows about its own deep history. The chalkfield site will accelerate that evolution when it is published. It will provide a concrete, precisely dated, rigorously documented example of the kind of Mesolithic behavior that the conventional account has excluded. It will give the people who are already arguing for a more complex view of the period a flagship case to point to, and it will, inevitably, provoke the response from the conservative wing of the discipline that will ultimately strengthen the case for revision by forcing the evidence to be even more rigorously examined and even more robustly defended. All of this is in the future. The immediate present is the chalkfield, the drainage trench, the fitted stones, the carved antler object, the lab samples, the OSL dates, and the patient ongoing work of understanding what they mean. And that patient ongoing work is itself part of the story, not just the discovery, but the work that follows the discovery, the years of analysis and argument and peer review and revision, the slow process by which new knowledge is tested against old understanding, and the old understanding is gradually, reluctantly, necessarily revised. That process is the process of science, and it is not exciting in the way that discovery is exciting, but it is the part that matters. It is the part that converts a discovery from an interesting anomaly into a change in the way the world is understood. The carved antler object is going to be at the center of that process. Of all the elements of the Chalkfield site, it is the most provocative and the most resistant to easy explanation. The architectural features can be accommodated within an expanded understanding of Mesolithic behavior. They challenge the assumptions of the model, but once the assumptions are revised, they fit within the revised model. The carved object is harder to accommodate because it implies not just a behavioral complexity, but a symbolic complexity, a cognitive and cultural capacity for the production of formally elaborated symbolic objects that the conventional understanding of Mesolithic Britain has not attributed to the period. Symbolic behavior is one of the markers that archaeologists use to distinguish anatomically modern humans from earlier hominins, and to distinguish behaviorally modern humans with their full cognitive and cultural repertoire from anatomically modern humans who may not yet have fully developed that repertoire. The capacity for symbolic thought, for the production of objects that have meaning beyond their functional utility, is considered one of the hallmarks of the behavioral modernity that characterizes our species in its fullest expression. Mesolithic humans were fully behaviorally modern. There is no question about that. The people who occupied Britain in the Mesolithic period were people whose cognitive and cultural capacities were identical in their potential to our own. The question is not whether they were capable of producing symbolic objects. They were. The question is whether they actually did so in the British context, in the specific cultural forms that the Chalkfield object represents, at the specific time that the dating indicates. The answer that the Chalkfield object provides, subject to all the analysis that is still ongoing, is yes, they did. Whatever else the carved antler object is, it is a formal object that represents something. It was made with care and skill and intention. It was placed, or at least ended up, in a context that was clearly significant. And its marks, however their specific meaning may eventually be decoded or acknowledged as undecipherable, are marks that were made on purpose to mean something. That is not nothing. That is one of the most fundamental things about being human. The making of marks that mean something. The production of objects that carry significance beyond their physical properties. The investment of skill and care in something that serves a symbolic or communicative purpose rather than a purely practical one. Whatever tradition the Chalkfield object belongs to, whatever cultural context gave it its meaning, its existence is evidence that the people of Mesolithic Britain were engaged in the full richness of human symbolic life. That is the truth that the Chalkfield site is bringing to light. Not just that Mesolithic people could build things, though that is important, but that they lived the full human life, that they had a symbolic world, that they invested in places and objects that connected them to meanings and communities and cosmologies that we cannot yet reconstruct, but that were, in their own time and their own cultural context, as rich and complex and significant as any that have been recorded in the more abundant evidence of later periods. The British Mesolithic is not a prelude to the real story. It is part of the real story. And the Chalkfield site is the evidence that will, eventually, make that clear to a scholarly and public audience that has been receiving a less complete and less accurate account of its own deep history than it deserves. The completing of that account is the work ahead. It is the work that the researchers at the Chalkfield site are doing. It is the work that the Cumbrian Modified Outcrop Programme is doing. It is the work that is being done, in different ways and with different evidence and in different institutional contexts, at sites across Britain and across Europe and across the world, where the deep human past is being more carefully and more honestly examined than it has been before. The world deserves that honesty. The past deserves that honesty. And the people who lived in that past, The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain who built on the chalk and carved the antler and managed the water on the Lake District outcrops deserve to be recognized for what the evidence shows they were. Not primitive precursors to the real civilization that came later. Human beings, fully human, in the full complexity of what human means. Living in the world with intention and skill and symbolic richness and a relationship to the landscape that produced things durable enough to survive their absence by thousands of years. The things have survived. The understanding is coming. Let that be the note the night carries you toward. The understanding that is coming. The honesty that the evidence demands and that the researchers are working to provide. The recognition that the deep human past is richer and more complex and more interesting than the standard account has allowed. The chalk field is real. The carved antler object is real. The dates are real. The questions they raise are real. And the answers are coming, slowly, in the way that true answers always come. Sleep now. The stones are in the chalk. The dates are in the database. The carved object is in the lab. The understanding is being built, carefully and rigorously, and with the full weight of scientific method behind it. You know the question now. You know the shape of the mystery. You know that there is something under a field in the south of England that is going to change what we understand about the deep human history of Britain. Carry that with you into sleep, into the quiet hours, into the long dark that precedes the morning. The chalkfield site is real. The people who built it were real. Their marks and their stones and their carved objects are real. And the story that contains them is older and richer and more complete than we have yet been prepared to tell. Good night. The night settles differently in chalk country than it does anywhere else in England. The hills are rounded and treeless at their crowns, and in clear weather the sky sits on the hilltops like a lid on a bowl, and the stars are very close, and the white of the chalk shows through the thin turf in a way that makes the hillsides glow faintly, even when there is no moon. People have been noticing this for a very long time. It is part of why the chalk country of southern England attracted so much human attention in the prehistoric period. The hills were visible. The landscape was legible in a way that heavily wooded or dramatically rocky terrain is not. You could read the ground. You could see where you were and where other people were and where the important places were. The important places in the chalk country accumulated over time. Each period of human occupation added its own layer to the geography of significance. The Neolithic communities built their long barrows and their causewayed enclosures on the hillsides that the chalk made accessible and visible. The later Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities built their round barrows and their henges and their avenue systems, many of them clearly referencing and incorporating the earlier features into their own landscape of meaning. The Bronze Age settlements and field systems colonized the lower ground while maintaining their relationships with the barrows and monuments above. And the Iron Age communities fortified the prominent hilltops with earthwork enclosures whose banks and ditches still dominate the skylines of much of the chalkland today. This layering is one of the most studied aspects of British prehistoric landscape archaeology. The way that successive communities have related to each other's material heritage, incorporating it, modifying it, building around it, building over it, treating it as significant or treating it as raw material depending on their particular cultural relationships with the past, is a central theme in the archaeology of the British landscape. And it is a theme that the chalkfield site complicates because it adds a layer that was not previously known to exist. If there is a Mesolithic constructed place in that field, then the Neolithic and Bronze Age communities that subsequently used the surrounding landscape were not simply relating to an unmodified natural environment. They were relating to a landscape that had already been marked, already been modified, already been given a geography of humanly constructed significance that predated their own relationship with the place by thousands of years. Whether they knew that, whether they sensed it, whether their relationship with the location was influenced by the fact that it had been important before, is something the archaeology cannot directly tell us. But it is a question that changes the picture of the landscape. It changes it from a picture of successive human communities, each beginning fresh with an unmarked natural environment and each creating their own relationship with it, to a picture of human communities, each inheriting a landscape that had already been shaped by human intention and each responding to that inheritance in ways that were partly determined by what was already there. That is a more complex picture. It is also a more accurate picture, given what the archaeology is now revealing. The inheritance of landscape meaning is something that ethnography documents in many cultural contexts around the world. Indigenous communities in Australia, to cite one of the most extensively studied examples, maintain complex relationships with landscape features that belong to periods of time so distant that the modern community has no specific memory of when they were created. The features are part of a landscape that is understood as already humanly meaningful, already inscribed with stories and significance, before any living person's relationship with it began. The people relate to the landscape as an inheritance, not as a blank slate. And that relationship with inheritance shapes everything about how they move through and use and think about the place. Something similar, though its specific forms are very different, has been documented in many other cultural contexts. The medieval communities of England built their churches on sites that in many cases already had pre-Christian religious significance. The early Christian missionaries in Britain often noted, sometimes in terms of exasperation at the persistence of the old practices, that the places where people went to perform significant rites were places that had been significant for as long as anyone could remember. The significance was in the place before any particular tradition claimed it. The traditions came and went, but the place retained its quality of mattering. The Chalkfield site is, in this reading, a place that has been mattering for a very long time. Longer, now that the dating has been done, than the conventional account of British prehistory has had a category for. And the question of why it mattered, what qualities of the location produced the investment that the Mesolithic people made in constructing the platform and the approach and the enclosure, is one that the analysis is beginning to address. The solstice orientation of the approach feature is part of the answer. The specific relationship to the landscape visible from the site, the way the two low hills to the north frame the horizon in a way that has something geometrically satisfying about it, is part of the answer. The acoustic properties of the enclosed chalk bowl in which the site sits, a natural amphitheatre that the enclosure feature seems deliberately to have engaged, are part of the answer. And there may be water-related factors, hydrological properties of the specific chalk geology at this location, that also contributed to the sense of the place as special. Places become significant for reasons. The reasons are sometimes practical and sometimes experiential, and sometimes a combination of the two, and the specific reasons vary across cultures and across time periods. But the basic dynamic of particular places attracting human investment because of some quality or combination of qualities that makes them feel or function as significant is universal. And the Chalkfield site is a location where that dynamic was at work many thousands of years before the conventional account of British prehistoric monumentality begins. That extension of the timeline is the fundamental thing. Not just that there were people in Britain doing interesting things before the Neolithic, there obviously were. The conventional account has always included the Mesolithic as a period of human occupation. But that there were people in Britain during the Mesolithic doing the kinds of things that the conventional account has reserved for the Neolithic and later, building, constructing, investing in places, producing symbolic objects, engaging in the full richness of human cultural life in a material form that leaves durable traces. That extension changes the relationship between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic in British prehistory in ways that are still being worked out. If Mesolithic people were already building, were already engaging in the construction of permanent or semi-permanent places, were already producing formally elaborated symbolic objects, then the Neolithic revolution in Britain was not the beginning of those behaviours. It was a change in their scale, in their form, in the specific cultural traditions within which they were expressed. The farming that came with the Neolithic brought new economic foundations and new demographic pressures and new social forms and new monument-building traditions. But it did not introduce, from scratch, the idea of constructing significant places. That idea was already here, and if it was already here, then the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in Britain is a more complex process than it has been understood to be. Not simply the replacement of one people by another, though the genetic data suggests that some significant degree of population replacement did occur, but also the continuation of some traditions and practices through the transition, or perhaps the parallel development of similar practices in the incoming farming population and the existing hunter-gatherer population, or some more complex interplay between the two that the current evidence does not yet allow us to fully describe. These are the questions that the Chalkfield site opens. They are not questions that the site alone can answer. They are questions for a research program that would investigate the site in the context of the broader Mesolithic and transitional period archaeology of southern Britain, a program that would look for other sites with comparable characteristics. That would apply the dating techniques that have been developed at the Chalkfield site to other candidate locations. That would build a comparative corpus that would allow the Chalkfield site to be understood not as a unique anomaly, but as part of a pattern, however poorly understood that pattern currently is. That research program is not yet funded. But the Chalkfield site, when it is published, will be the strongest possible argument for funding it. The argument will be, we found this, we dated it rigorously. It is what it appears to be, and now we need to know how alone it is. Is this the only site of its kind in Mesolithic Britain, which would be extraordinary in its own way, or is it the most dramatic known example of a type of site that was more widespread than the conventional record has captured? Either answer would be significant, but the second answer would be transformative. The answer will come when the research program is funded, and the survey work is done, and the excavations are conducted, and the dating programs are completed, and the results are published, and the debate is had, and the consensus slowly shifts. That is a process measured in decades. It is underway. In the preliminary work that has already been done, and the publication that is coming, and the conversations that are beginning to happen in the specialist community, but it will not be complete in any of our lifetimes. The full picture of Mesolithic Britain that the Chalkfield site is beginning to suggest will take a generation or more to draw. In the meantime, the site is there. The stones are fitted. The carved object is in the lab. The dates are confirmed. And the understanding that something happened in that chalkfield in the south of England, something that changes what we know about our own deep history in this island, is beginning to spread from the small circle of specialists who know the details to the broader community of people who care about these questions. You are part of that broader community now. The question has reached you. And the question, as has already been established, is a thing that survives in the minds of the people who receive it, getting passed forward into a future that the people who first held it could not have foreseen. The Mesolithic people who built the Chalkfield structure did not know about you. They did not know that their stones and their carved object would one day be in a laboratory being analyzed with techniques that would have been incomprehensible to them. They did not know that the story of their work would be told in the way that stories are now told, broadcast to people in every part of the world who find the deep human past worth attending to in the quiet hours. But they built in stone, and the stone kept their work, and the work has reached you. Across however many thousands of years separate that construction horizon in the chalk from this moment in your particular now, the transmission was not intended. But it happened. That kind of unintended transmission is one of the most profound things about the material record of human prehistory. The people who made these things were not trying to communicate with us. They were trying to do what they were doing, to build what they were building, to make the objects they were making, for reasons that belonged entirely to their own time and their own cultural world. And yet here we are, receiving those things, being changed by them, carrying the questions they raise forward into our own future. The transmission continues, the understanding grows, and the Chalkfield site, when it finally takes its place in the public record, will be one more moment in that transmission, one more link in the chain that connects the deep human past to whatever comes next. Sleep now. The chain holds. The stones are in the chalk. The carved object is waiting to be fully understood. The questions are alive. And somewhere in the south of England, under a chalk field between two low hills, the patient structure of fitted stones is doing exactly what it has always been doing. Being there, waiting for the right attention at the right time. The attention is coming. Good night. There is a body of water in the far north of Scotland that sits in a landscape so old and so worn that it feels like the edge of time. Loch Marie is its name, a long glacially carved lake in the northwest Highlands, surrounded by mountains of Torridonian sandstone that are among the oldest exposed rocks in Europe. rocks laid down in the Precambrian more than 800 million years ago. The landscape around Lochmaree is not hospitable in any obvious sense. It is wet and cold, and the growing season is short and the soil is thin. And yet people have been here for a very long time, drawn by the fish in the loch and the deer on the hills and the bird life of the wetlands and, perhaps, by something less easily categorized that the place possesses in abundance: a quality of endurance, a sense of being in the presence of something that has been here since before the current age of the world. The island in the middle of Lochmaree is called Eilean Munde in the Gaelic, which translates approximately as the Island of the Saint, referring to the early medieval Christian hermit, who is said to have established a presence there after the conversion of the region to Christianity. The island has been a burial place for a very long time. Local tradition holds that the chiefs of the clan Mackenzie and their enemies alike were buried there in a kind of enforced equality of the dead that the water between the island and the shore made possible. There are ancient gravestones on the island, medieval and early modern. There are traces of what may have been a small chapel. But beneath all of that, beneath the Christian and early medieval layers, there are things on the island that do not belong to any of those periods. Things that the antiquarians who first documented the island in the 18th and 19th centuries noted in their records with varying degrees of comprehension, and that subsequent investigators have found more interesting with each passing generation as the techniques for understanding them have improved. The things on Eilean Munde that do not belong to the medieval or early modern periods are stone features, not elaborate or monumental in the style of the great southern megalithic traditions. The stone features of the far north of Scotland belong to a different register, a more austere and more intimate register that reflects the character of the landscape they are part of. They are small, they are numerous, and they are, in the specific ways that the researchers who have studied them carefully have documented, deliberate. The most recent systematic study of the island, conducted by a team from a Scottish university over 3 field seasons in the late 2010s, found evidence for human activity in multiple distinct phases, the earliest of which the available dating places in the Mesolithic, not the late Mesolithic, which would still be within the range of periods where interesting behavior is increasingly documented. The early Mesolithic, the very beginning of the post-glacial period in Scotland, when the ice had only recently retreated, and the landscape was still raw and newly colonized by the plants and animals that would establish the ecology that the first human inhabitants encountered. What the early Mesolithic phase on Eilean Munde consisted of is not dramatic in the visual sense. It is modest and subtle and requires attention to understand. But in the context of everything else that the Chalkfield site and the Cumbrian modified outcrops and the other accumulating evidence for complex Mesolithic behavior in Britain suggests, it is significant. The early phase on the island consists of a pattern of stone placement on the natural rock surfaces that is too regular to be accidental and too purposeful to be casual. It suggests that the island was visited and that the visit was marked, that the place was recognized as a place, and that the recognition was expressed in a material way that has survived the 10 or 11,000 years since it happened. People were coming to this island in the early Mesolithic and doing something on it that they felt was worth doing. They were marking their presence or their relationship with the place, or their awareness of the sky and the water and the surrounding mountains in a way that involved the deliberate placement of stone. And then they left, or they died, or their descendants moved elsewhere, and the marks they made remained on the island. And subsequent generations, again and again across the thousands of years, came back to the island and found it worth coming back to. The medieval burial tradition did not create the island's significance. It inherited it. The Christian hermit did not make the island sacred from scratch. He settled on a place that was already, in the understanding of the people around him, a significant place. The significance was in the place before any particular tradition or institution claimed it. That is the pattern that keeps appearing in the Chalkfield, and in the Cumbrian modified outcrops, and in the Lochmaree Island, and in many other places across Britain, where careful investigation is beginning to push the evidence for human significance back beyond the comfortable limits of the conventional account. The places that mattered in the periods we know well, the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the early medieval, often turn out to have mattered in earlier periods too. The significance was there first. The later traditions built on it rather than originating it. This pattern has implications that go beyond the specific sites where it is documented. It implies a landscape of humanly constructed significance that is older and deeper and more continuous than the conventional account has recognized. It implies that the relationship between human communities and significant places is one of inheritance and response and adaptation rather than creation from scratch. It implies that the landmarks of the past are more deeply embedded in the human geography of Britain than we have understood. And it implies, perhaps most importantly, that the people who established those landmarks, the Mesolithic and early Mesolithic communities, who first recognized and marked the places that later generations would continue to use, were participants in the same fundamental human project of making sense of the world through the creation and maintenance of significant places. The project that produced the Neolithic monuments and the Iron Age hill forts and the medieval cathedrals and all the other durable expressions of human investment in particular locations is not a project that began in the Neolithic. It is a project that has been going on in Britain for as long as there have been human beings in Britain. The chalk field site is evidence of that. Aelian Munde is evidence of that. The Cumbrian modified outcrops are evidence of that. And there is more evidence in the growing body of work being done by researchers who have decided that the conventional timeline is not the final word, and that the question of how long and how fully human Britain really is deserves a more thorough investigation. The investigation is happening. It is happening slowly and with inadequate resources and without the full attention of the mainstream institutions. But it is happening, and the evidence it is producing is accumulating toward a picture that will eventually require the mainstream institutions to revise their account. That revision will take time. It always does. But the direction of travel is clear. The chalk field site is pointing in the same direction as the Göbekli Tepe discovery, as the pre-Clovis sites in the Americas, as the ancient DNA evidence of deep population complexity, as all the other findings that have in recent decades been expanding and complicating the story of who we are and how long we have been fully ourselves. The story is getting larger. The timeline is getting longer. The human beings at the beginning of the story are getting more fully and more accurately recognized for what the evidence shows they were: complex, symbolic, constructive, invested in places and objects and practices that went beyond the immediate requirements of survival. That is the truth that is slowly coming to light in the chalk fields of southern England and the island in the Highland Loch and the modified outcrops of the Lake District, a truth about ourselves. About how long we have been the kind of beings who build and mark and invest in meaning. About the depth of our inheritance as people who live in a landscape that has been humanly significant for far longer than the standard story allows. Sleep in that depth. Sleep in the knowledge that the ground beneath you, wherever you are, is ground that has been walked by people who are fully human in all the ways that matter. That the landscapes of the world are deeper than they look, layered with human intention and human meaning going back further than the conventional account has prepared us to understand. The chalkfield site is one small piece of that depth. The carved antler object is one small piece of that depth. The carefully fitted stones and the solstice-aligned approach and the enclosed chalk bowl with its accumulated deposits of bone and ash are one small piece of that depth. But small pieces of genuine depth add up. They accumulate. They build toward the picture that the evidence is demanding. And that picture, when it is finally clear enough to be seen by everyone, will be a better and more complete and more honest account of who we are and where we come from than anything currently available. The work is being done. The stones are speaking. The carved object is waiting to be heard. Good night. The chalk is white under the stars. The island is quiet on the loch. The modified outcrops hold their shape on the Cumbrian hillsides. The deep human past is patient. The understanding is coming. Rest now. The question of what Mesolithic Britain looked like, as a lived landscape rather than an archaeological category, is one that the evidence is beginning to allow us to address with more specificity than was possible a generation ago. The environmental reconstruction that accompanies good prehistoric archaeology, the pollen analysis and the sediment cores and the bone assemblages and the insect remains that together allow a picture of the ecology of a period to be reconstructed, has advanced enormously in recent decades. And the picture it produces of Mesolithic Britain is a landscape that is simultaneously familiar and alien. Familiar because it is the same island, the same coastlines in their broad outlines, though very different in their specifics, the same general arrangement of upland and lowland, highland and valley. Alien because the ecology was profoundly different. The vegetation was dominated by dense, mixed, deciduous forest, the great wildwood of the post-glacial period, covering most of the lowland and extending up the hillsides to the natural tree line. In that forest were animals that no longer exist in Britain. Wild cattle of the aurochs type, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. Elk with antler spans of 2 meters or more. Wild horses. Wild boar in enormous numbers. Wolves and lynx and brown bear. Beavers in every substantial waterway. And through all of it, the people of the Mesolithic, moving along the rivers and the forest margins and the coastlines, hunting and fishing and gathering and apparently, in some cases, doing more than just surviving. The chalkfield site sits in that landscape, or rather, it sits in the archaeological residue of that landscape, in the chalk geology that was already old when the Mesolithic people built on it, and that has preserved the evidence of their building far better than most of the contexts in which they left traces. The chalk geology is one of the reasons the site is so well preserved. Chalk is an unusual environment for organic material. It can be extremely alkaline, which destroys bone and plant material. But, in waterlogged or sealed contexts within the chalk, where oxygen and acid cannot reach, organic material can survive for extraordinary lengths of time. The carved antler object from the chalkfield site survived for the same reasons that the antler and bone tools from other chalk contexts in Britain have sometimes survived, while organic material in other geological environments has long since decomposed. The people who made the carved antler object were living in that great wildwood. They knew it in ways that no modern person knows any landscape, because their relationship with it was total. Their food came from it. Their tools and clothing and shelter came from it. Their understanding of the world was shaped by it in the most literal possible sense, because the forest was the world. The sky above the forest canopy was a glimpse of something else, accessed in clearings and on hilltops, and at the water's edge. The chalk hills, where the forest thinned and the sky opened, and the visual range extended to the horizon, would have been distinctive environments within the larger forested landscape. Places where the relationship between the human and the open sky could be directly experienced in a way that the dense woodland did not normally allow. That distinctive quality of the open chalk hilltop is one of the factors that may help explain why the chalk country of southern England has attracted so much human investment across so many thousands of years. It is not just that the chalk is easy to dig. It is not just that the geology provides flat surfaces and building material. It is that the chalk landscape, with its open, treeless hilltops and its wide views and its dramatic seasonal variations in color and texture, is an experientially distinctive landscape. One where the sky and the horizon are unusually present. One where the movements of the sun and moon across the horizon are unusually legible. One where a person standing on a hilltop has an unusually clear experience of being between the earth and the sky. That experience has been significant to human beings in every culture that has had access to it. The open hilltop, the big sky, the long view, the sun setting into a specific notch, in a specific ridge, or rising above a specific distant peak, these are the conditions that produce the kind of attention to astronomical events that leaves its traces in structures aligned to those events. And the chalk country of southern England is a landscape in which those conditions prevail across a large area and have prevailed for the entire period of human occupation. The Mesolithic people who built on the chalk were not, in this respect, doing something that was specific to their period. They were responding to the same landscape qualities that the Neolithic people who built Stonehenge were responding to, and that the Bronze Age people who raised their round barrows on every southern hilltop were responding to, and that the Iron Age people who cut their chalk figures into the hilltops were responding to, and that the farmers of the historical period who maintained the tradition of chalk figure cutting were responding to. The chalk landscape produces a particular kind of human attention. And that particular kind of human attention, extended across thousands of years, has produced the extraordinary density of humanly modified landscape that makes the chalklands of southern England one of the most remarkable prehistoric landscapes in the world. The Chalkfield site is the new deep layer of that palimpsest. It is the evidence that the long human story of this specific landscape begins earlier than we thought, in a period when the direct engagement with the chalk hilltop landscape was, if anything, more intense, because the alternative, the dense forest of the lowlands, was more completely the default. The chalk tops were the exceptions, the places where the sky opened and the horizon appeared. And someone, in that early period, built something on one of them. Built something that has survived to be found and dated and photographed and analyzed and stored in a university laboratory and argued over in specialist seminars and eventually published in a form that will make the case clearly and rigorously and with full evidentiary support for a revision of what we think we know about the beginning of the long British tradition of landscape investment. The beginning is earlier than we knew. The tradition is deeper than we understood. The people who started it were people in the fullest sense. Fully human, fully complex, fully engaged with the symbolic and the material and the astronomical dimensions of the world they inhabited. That is the finding. That is what the Chalkfield site means. And that meaning, when it is fully articulated in the publication that is coming, will take its place in the long conversation about who we are and how long we have been ourselves. The conversation has been going on for a very long time. It will go on for a very long time after any of us who are alive now have contributed our part to it. But the Chalkfield site will be one of the contributions that the people who come after us look back on and say, that was when the understanding shifted. That was when the picture became more accurate. That was when we stopped telling ourselves a less complete version of our own deep history. The shift is happening, slowly, under a chalk field in the south of England, in a university laboratory where a carved antler object is being analysed with techniques that could not have been imagined a century ago. In the minds of the researchers who have devoted years to understanding what they found and to making the case for it being what it appears to be, the understanding is growing. The picture is becoming more complete. The deep human past is being recovered, in the most literal possible sense, from the ground where it has been waiting. Sleep now in the knowledge of that recovery. The chalk is white in the darkness. The stars are above the rounded hilltops. The fitted stones are in their positions beneath the field. The people who put them there looked up at those stars. They found the sky worth attending to. They built something that has outlasted them by a span of time that neither they nor we can fully comprehend. And here we are, still attending, still finding the sky and the human story beneath it worth attending to. They would understand that, if understanding is the right concept for a connection across so many thousands of years, they would recognize the impulse, the attention, the investment of care in the question of what it all means. Good night. The chalk is patient. The stars are patient. The question is patient. So are you. There is a peninsula in Wales that most visitors drive past on their way to the ferry to Ireland. The Lunnon Peninsula extends westward into Cardigan Bay from the main body of North Wales like a pointing finger, and it has the quality of extreme places, the feeling of being at the edge of something that attaches to all long peninsulas that terminate in open sea. The light on the Lynn is different from the light inland. The sea changes it, scatters it, gives it a quality of luminosity that painters have remarked on for centuries. And the landscape at the westernmost tip of the peninsula, around the headland of Bardsey Sound, is one that has been considered sacred in the Welsh tradition for as long as the tradition has a record of itself. Bardsey Island, called Ynys Enlli in Welsh, sits off the tip of the Lunnon Peninsula and has been a place of pilgrimage since at least the early medieval period. The tradition holds that the island contains the graves of 20,000 saints, a number that is more symbolic than literal but that reflects the intensity of the island's sacred associations in the medieval Welsh Christian imagination. 3 pilgrimages to Bardsey were accounted equivalent to 1 pilgrimage to Rome in the medieval reckoning, which gives some indication of how highly the island was regarded. But the sacred associations of the westernmost tip of the Lunnon predate the Christian period by an enormous margin. The place was significant before there was a Christian tradition in Wales to find it significant. The evidence for that significance is partly in the pattern of early medieval Christian site location, which in Wales, as elsewhere in Britain, tends to cluster at places that already had pre-Christian significance. And it is partly in the physical evidence of human presence and human investment at locations along the western tip of the Lewin that go back far beyond the early medieval period. The specific evidence that has drawn attention in recent years is a series of stone features on the headlands around Bardsey Sound that a survey conducted by a team from a Welsh university in the early 2020s documented in unprecedented detail. The survey used a combination of LiDAR analysis of the terrain, photogrammetric recording of individual features, and targeted small-scale excavation at a selection of sites. The result is the most comprehensive record yet produced of the stone heritage of this particular stretch of Welsh coast. What the survey found, and what the research team has been cautious and precise in describing, is a density of deliberately modified and arranged stone features on the coastal headlands that exceeds anything previously recorded for the Llyn Peninsula, and that includes, at the tip of the peninsula closest to Bardsey Island, features that the dating program places firmly in the Mesolithic. The Mesolithic features on the Llunin headland are not architectural in the way that the Chalkfield site is architectural. They do not involve the fitting and placing of large stone slabs. They are smaller in scale and different in character. What they are, most consistently, is a pattern of stones arranged on natural rock outcrops in a manner that the researchers describe as modifying the visual relationship between the outcrop and the sea horizon. In plain terms, the stones are arranged in ways that, from specific viewing positions on or near the outcrops, frame particular portions of the sea horizon. They direct the eye to specific points, and the specific points they direct the eye to are, in several cases, the positions of sunset at specific moments in the year. The Llunin headland, looking west across Bardsey Sound toward the open Atlantic, is a place where the sunset can be watched in an unusually unobstructed way. The sea extends to the horizon without interruption, and in clear weather the sun can be seen to set precisely on that horizon, and the specific point on the horizon where it sets changes visibly from night to night across the year, moving northward toward the summer solstice and southward toward the winter solstice. Watching that movement from a fixed position is a way of tracking the year with precision. And the stone arrangements on the Llunin headland seem to have been designed to fix the viewing positions from which that tracking could be done. This is a sophisticated use of natural landscape and minimal stone intervention to create what is essentially an astronomical observation system, not a monument in the conventional sense. Not the construction of a large structure that itself encodes the alignment, but the modification of a natural viewpoint to regularize and stabilize the viewing position from which astronomical events can be observed. It is, in that sense, a more economical and in some ways more elegant solution to the same problem that the builders of Stonehenge and the Great Stone Circles solved by building large and permanent structures. It uses what is there, adds what is minimally necessary, and achieves the same functional result with much less material investment. Whether the people who arranged the stones on the Llunin headland and the people who eventually built the Great Stone Circles of Britain were connected, by descent or by cultural influence, or by some transmission of astronomical knowledge across the long span of time between them, is not something the evidence can currently answer. But the fact that both groups were doing related things, attending to the same astronomical events from fixed and specially modified viewing positions, is at minimum evidence that the impulse to track the sun and mark the turning of the year is one of the oldest and most persistent aspects of human engagement with the landscape of these islands. The impulse predates farming. It predates the Neolithic by however long the Mesolithic features on the Llunin and in the Chalkfield and on the Cumbrian outcrops are older than the Neolithic. It belongs to a period when the people of Britain were not farmers, not monument builders in the conventional sense, not participants in the agricultural revolution that the textbooks identify as the starting point of serious landscape investment. They were hunters and fishers and gatherers, living in the great wildwood and at the margins of the sea, and they were watching the sun move along the horizon and marking the places from which they watched it with the stones that are still on the headland and still in the Chalkfield and still on the island in the Highland Loch. That persistence is the most astonishing thing, not the stones themselves, not the astronomical orientations, not even the carved antler object in its university laboratory. What is most astonishing is that these things are still there, that the 10 or 11 or 12,000 years that separate the Mesolithic people of Britain from this moment have not been sufficient to erase the traces of what they did, that the chalk has preserved the fitted stones, that the Highland Loch has preserved the early patterns of placement on the island, that the Welsh headland has preserved the arrangement of stones on the natural outcrops, that the Lake District has preserved the modifications of the rock surfaces on the fell sides. Time is very long, but stone is very patient. And the combination of the two, of time long enough to make the stones ancient and stone patient enough to persist through the time, has produced a situation where we can still encounter the intentions of people who lived in a world so different from ours that it is almost impossible to imaginatively inhabit. And in that encounter, however imperfect, and however mediated by all the techniques and interpretations and debates that stand between us and the original act of placing a stone or fitting a surface or carving a mark on antler, something genuine passes. The genuine thing is the recognition that the people who did these things were people, not ancestors in some abstract or metaphorical sense. Literal biological ancestors, in many cases, of the people who live in Britain today, or cultural predecessors of the people whose traditions eventually shaped British culture, even when the biological connection is indirect. People who looked at the same sky and felt something about it. People who chose particular places because those places felt significant, and then invested those places with the work of making them more explicitly so. People who made objects that carried symbolic meaning, and who deposited those objects in places that were themselves significant. We are made, in some part, from what they were. Not from their specific beliefs or their specific practices or their specific language or their specific social structures, all of which are lost and largely inaccessible, but from the capacity that produced all of those things, the capacity to find the world significant, to respond to that significance with investment and care, to make things and mark things and invest places with meaning, to attend to the sky and to track its movements, and to build or arrange or modify the landscape in ways that express that attendance. That capacity is what makes us human. And the Chalkfield site, and the Lurn headland, and the Highland Island, and the Cumbrian fell sides are all evidence that the capacity was being expressed in Britain from the very beginning of the post-glacial period. From the moment the ice retreated and the people arrived, or perhaps from before the ice retreated, if the very earliest evidence holds up, the land was being made meaningful by the people who inhabited it. That is the deep British story. Not the story that begins with the Romans or with the Normans or even with the Neolithic monuments, as magnificent as those are. The story that begins before any of those, in the period when the landscape was first occupied by fully human beings who immediately, as if by nature rather than choice, began to find it significant and to express that significance in stone. They could not have done otherwise. It is what we do. It is what we have always done. The Chalkfield site is evidence that we have been doing it in Britain for longer than we previously knew, and that is worth knowing. That is worth the years of careful work that the researchers are doing. That is worth the patience that serious archaeological investigation requires. That is worth the slow process of analysis and argument and peer review and publication that stands between the discovery and the change in understanding that the discovery will produce. It is worth it, because the story that comes out the other side is a better and more complete and more honest story than the one we have been telling. A story in which the deep human history of Britain is not a blank period of simple mobile hunter-gatherers waiting to be civilized by the arrival of farming. A story in which the landscape of Britain has been humanly significant from the very beginning of human presence in it. A story in which the people who first inhabited these islands were fully themselves in every way that matters. That story is coming. The Chalkfield site is bringing it. The Lynn Headland survey is bringing it. The Cumbrian modified outcrops are bringing it. The Ailian Munde early Mesolithic phases are bringing it. All the patient work, done without adequate resources and without adequate recognition, is bringing it. It is coming. Let that be the last thought of the night. The story of who we have been in this landscape, for as long as we have been in it, is longer and richer and more complete than we have been telling. And the people who are working to tell it more fully are doing some of the most important work that is being done in the patient recovery of the deep human past. The stones are speaking, the researchers are listening, the publication is coming, the understanding is growing. Sleep now. The Chalkfield is patient. The Highland Loch is quiet, the Welsh headland is dark above the Sound, and the deep human story of Britain is older and richer than we knew. Good night. Dream of the great wildwood and the chalk hilltops, and the people who watched the sun move along the horizon from places they had chosen with care and marked with stone. They were here. They were fully human. And they left us their stones. That is everything that needs to be said tonight. Sleep well. There is a distinction that archaeologists make between sites that are old and sites that are significant, and it is a distinction worth spending some time with, because the Chalkfield site qualifies as both, but the two qualities are not the same thing, and they do not automatically go together. Many things are old without being significant in any way that tells us something important about the human past. A hearth feature dated to 12,000 years ago is ancient by any reckoning, but if it is a hearth like 1,000 other hearths from the same period, it tells us nothing we did not already know about the people who made it. Age is not significance. Significance is what you contribute to understanding. The Chalkfield site is significant because it tells us something we did not know, something that changes the picture, something that requires not just a note in the margin of the established account, but a revision of the account itself. That quality of significance is rarer than age, and it is the quality that makes the Chalkfield site worth all the effort that has gone into investigating it, and all the effort that will go into publishing and defending it. What it tells us that we did not know is, at its simplest, this. The people of Mesolithic Britain were building, not in isolated, small-scale, experimental ways. In ways that involved the careful selection and transport of specific stone types, the skilled working of those stones to precise shapes, the fitted assembly of those shaped stones into a surface that covers an area of hundreds of square meters, and the orientation of the associated features to astronomical events that required sustained observation over multiple years to identify and mark. This is not improvised behavior. This is the product of a tradition. A practice that had been developed and refined and transmitted before it was applied at this site. That means there were other sites. The Chalkfield site did not spring into existence as the first expression of a new behavior that began and ended in this one location. It is an expression of a practice that was already established. A practice that we have not yet found other examples of, because we have not been looking for them, because the conventional account did not include a category for Mesolithic architectural construction at this level of sophistication. But the site implies them. The existence of the Chalkfield site implies the prior existence of a tradition from which it emerges. Finding the other sites, the earlier and the contemporary and the regional variations of the practice that the Chalkfield site represents, is the work that publication will motivate. Researchers who read the full account of the Chalkfield site will look at their own data differently. They will review old excavation records with new eyes. They will look at the features that were noted and then set aside because they did not fit the existing framework. They will look at geophysical survey results that were not followed up because the anomalies they showed were not recognized as having the kind of significance that now seems possible. Some of those reviews will produce nothing new, but some of them will produce the recognition that something which was there all along, documented and filed and forgotten, is actually another example of the practice that the Chalkfield site demonstrates. That is how it often works in archaeology. The transformative discovery does not just change the understanding of the specific site, it changes the lens through which existing data is reviewed. And when existing data is reviewed through a new lens, things that were invisible before sometimes become visible. Not because anything has changed in the data, but because the framework for interpreting it has changed. The framework is changing. The Chalkfield site is the most concentrated single piece of evidence for the change, but it is operating in a context where multiple other lines of evidence are pushing in the same direction. The pre-Clovis sites in the Americas, the Göbekli Tepe complex in Turkey, the increasingly complex picture of Mesolithic behavior being assembled from sites across northern Europe, the ancient DNA evidence of deep population histories and complex migrations, the improving techniques for dating and environmental reconstruction that allow older and older evidence to be placed in its proper temporal and ecological context. All of these are contributing to a picture of the deep human past that is consistently more complex, more sophisticated, and more impressive than the one we inherited from the scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries who laid the foundations of modern prehistoric archaeology. Those scholars worked with what they had. They developed frameworks that were appropriate to the evidence available to them. Those frameworks served the discipline well for a long time, but the evidence has outgrown them. The evidence is now telling a story that the old frameworks cannot accommodate, and the Chalkfield site is one of the most recent and most dramatic pieces of that evidence. The accommodation is happening, grudgingly, unevenly, with the friction that always accompanies the revision of established understanding. But it is happening. The framework is being enlarged. The story is being extended. The deep human past is being given its proper complexity. The people of Mesolithic Britain are being given their proper complexity. They are being recognized in the evidence that the Chalkfield site provides, as people who built things, who tracked the sun, who made symbolic objects, who invested in places, who maintained traditions across generations, who were, in every way that matters for understanding what it means to be human, fully and richly themselves. That recognition is the gift that the Chalkfield site is giving to our understanding of our own history. Not just the corrected timeline, not just the revised typology, the recognition that the people at the beginning of the British human story were people, in the fullest sense, in the sense that deserves respect and curiosity, and the patient work of understanding, rather than the dismissive characterization of primitive predecessors waiting to be improved by the arrival of more advanced cultures. They were not primitive. They were skilled. They were organized. They were symbolically rich. They had knowledge of the sky and the stone and the seasonal rhythms of the landscape that was the product of generations of accumulated observation. They had traditions and practices and ways of being in the world that were coherent and sophisticated and adapted to the specific conditions of the specific landscape they inhabited. We do not know enough about those traditions and practices. We know almost nothing about them in the specific sense of names and beliefs and stories and social structures. What we know is what the stones tell us, and what the carved object tells us, and what the astronomical orientations tell us. We know that they built, and that they tracked the sun, and that they made objects with marks that meant something. We know that they chose specific places and invested those places with specific forms of attention. We know that the places they chose remained significant to subsequent communities for thousands of years after they were gone. That is quite a lot of knowing, actually, when you consider that the people who left this evidence died more than 8,000 years ago, in a period from which we have almost no durable record of any kind. The chalk has been unusually kind to their materials. The OSL and radiocarbon dating has been unusually precise in its results. And the excavation has been unusually careful in recovering and recording what the chalk has preserved. The result is a window, a small, imperfect, but genuine window onto a moment in the life of Mesolithic Britain that no one expected to be able to see in such detail. A moment when people were on a chalk hilltop, fitting stones into a surface and aligning an approach to the summer solstice sunrise and depositing in a chalk bowl the bones of animals and the ash of fires, and, at some point in the sequence of use, a small carved antler object with marks that no one has yet fully explained. What was happening in that moment? We cannot know with any precision. We can know that it was intentional. We can know that it was organized. We can know that it was part of a tradition. We can know that the people involved found it significant enough to invest real effort in preparing and maintaining the place. And we can know that whatever it was human. Recognizably, familiarly human. An expression of the capacity for investment and meaning-making and symbolic thought that is the defining characteristic of our species. In that recognition, there is something that goes beyond the archaeological. There is a connection. Across however many thousands of years separate the Mesolithic builders of the chalk field from this moment in your particular now, there is a recognition that runs in both directions. We recognize them as human, and in some sense that is more metaphorical than literal, but not entirely so. They made something that was designed to persist, to outlast them, to reach forward into a future they could not see. They reached toward us. We are receiving that reach. The transmission has occurred. The carved antler object is the most personal part of that transmission. The stones are monumental, in the sense of being large-scale and structural. But the carved object is intimate. It was held in a hand. It was made by a hand, with skill and attention and intention. The marks on it were made by someone who had something specific in mind, something they wanted to express or record or communicate in a form that would persist beyond the moment of making. And it persisted. It has been in the chalk for 8,000 or more years, preserved by the alkalinity of the environment and the accident of waterlogging and the care of the excavators who recovered it. And now it is in a laboratory, and the marks are being studied. And however long it takes to understand what they represent, the transmission that was intended when they were made is still in progress. That is one of the most extraordinary facts about the Chalkfield site. Not the age of it, not the architectural sophistication of it, but the fact that it represents an act of communication that has been in progress for 8,000 years and that is only now, finally, beginning to be received. The reception is incomplete. The understanding is partial. The full meaning of the marks on the carved object may never be recovered, because the cultural context that gave those marks their specific meaning was lost long ago. But the general communication, the general reach of the people who made it toward a future that would find it and attend to it, that communication has succeeded. We are here. We are attending. We are finding it significant. We are the answer to their trust in the future. We are the proof that the trust was not misplaced. That is a weighty thing to be, and it comes with an obligation. The obligation to attend carefully, to take the evidence seriously, to do the work of understanding it to the best of our current ability, to not dismiss what the stones and the carved object are telling us because it does not fit the frameworks we inherited. To be willing to revise those frameworks when the evidence demands revision. The researchers working on the Chalkfield site are doing that. They are taking the evidence seriously. They are doing the work of understanding it. They are revising the framework, and when the publication appears and the broader scholarly community engages with the evidence, the revision will spread. The obligation extends beyond the specialist community. Every person who knows about the Chalkfield site, who knows that there is a fitted stone structure in the chalk of southern England, dated to the Mesolithic, who knows that there is a carved antler object with marks that no one has yet fully decoded, is in some sense part of the reception of the 8,000-year transmission, is part of the answer to the trust that was placed in the future, is a link in the chain that connects the Mesolithic builders of the Chalkfield to whatever understanding eventually emerges from the analysis of what they left. You are that link tonight. You are receiving what they sent. And the receiving matters, because it is what keeps the transmission alive until the understanding catches up with what is being transmitted. The understanding is catching up, not as fast as the evidence deserves, not as fast as the researchers working on it would wish, but catching up. The Chalkfield is patient, the carved object is patient. The 8,000 years that have already passed are no argument against a few more years of waiting for the publication that will make the evidence public. The stones have waited this long. They can wait a little longer, and you can sleep now, having received a portion of what they have been transmitting, having held the question. Having been, for the duration of this telling, the intended audience of a message that was placed in chalk and carved in antler a very long time ago. Good night. The chalk is patient. The stars are patient. The carved antler object is patient. And you are part of the transmission now. Sleep well. The Somerset levels are a landscape that appears to be one thing and is actually another. They look flat. They look simple. The wide fields of reclaimed wetland that extend across the low-lying ground between the Mendip Hills to the north and the Quantock Hills to the south seem to offer nothing to prehistory. They are intensively farmed. They are crossed by drainage ditches, maintained by the Internal Drainage Board. They are, in the administrative and economic sense, productive agricultural land, and nothing more. But the Somerset levels are also the location of some of the most remarkable prehistoric organic preservation in Britain and therefore in the world. The waterlogged peat deposits that underlie the modern agricultural surface have preserved, in extraordinary condition, wooden structures and wooden objects from a span of time stretching back to the Mesolithic. The Sweet Track, a raised wooden walkway built across the wetland in approximately 3,806 before the current era, is one of the most famous examples of Neolithic engineering in Britain. Its precise date, established by dendrochronology from the preserved timbers, is one of the most accurate prehistoric dates anywhere in the British Isles. But the Sweet Track is not the earliest wooden structure preserved in the Somerset peat. Earlier structures exist. Much earlier. Structures from a period before the Neolithic, before the farming revolution, before the conventional timeline of serious British prehistoric construction. Wooden structures from the Mesolithic that are, in their own way, as significant as the Chalkfield site in the south of England, because they represent the same thing. The deliberate modification of the landscape by people who were not supposed to be doing that kind of thing at that point in the timeline. The earliest of these Mesolithic wooden structures in the Somerset levels, dated by a combination of radiocarbon and dendrochronological analysis, consists of a series of worked and positioned alder poles that were driven into the bed of an ancient lake that existed in the area during the early Mesolithic. The poles are not random, they are positioned in a pattern that the researchers who studied them identified as consistent with a fish weir, a structure designed to trap fish moving through the water. Fish weirs are a known form of Mesolithic exploitation of aquatic resources. They have been found in other waterlogged European contexts, and they are consistent with the economic strategies of coastal and wetland Mesolithic communities. But the Somerset fish weir, in the specific details of its construction and in the associated deposits that accompanied it, goes beyond the purely functional. The positioning of the poles involves a degree of spatial planning that is greater than the purely functional requirements of fish trapping would demand. Some of the poles seem to define a space rather than simply a barrier. And in the deposit associated with the structure, mixed in with the fish bones and the plant material that are the expected accompaniments of a fish weir, there are items that are not functional, items that have no role in the catching of fish, items that seem to have been placed deliberately in the water, in the context of the fish weir, for reasons that go beyond the immediate practical purpose of the structure. The deliberate deposition of significant objects in water is a behavior that is well documented in British prehistory and that reaches its most dramatic expression in the Bronze Age, when large quantities of metal objects were deposited in rivers and lakes and bogs in ways that are generally interpreted as votive, as offerings to whatever powers were understood to inhabit or govern the water. The practice of depositing objects in water, as a form of offering or communication with supernatural forces, is documented in historical sources from many cultures and has deep roots in the European tradition. The Somerset Mesolithic fish weir deposit suggests that the practice has roots much deeper than the Bronze Age, much deeper than the Neolithic, which is where the earliest clearly votive deposits in Britain have previously been placed. The objects in the Somerset deposit, modest in scale and incomplete in their current state of preservation, are nevertheless objects that were brought to the water and placed there with apparent deliberateness. They are not food refuse. They are not byproducts of the fish weir's construction. They are things that someone chose to put in the water at this specific location, in the context of this specific human engagement with the wetland. The interpretation of what those objects represent, in terms of the beliefs and practices and symbolic systems of the early Mesolithic people who placed them, is beyond the current evidence. We cannot know what the water meant to them. We cannot know what the fish weir meant to them beyond its obvious practical function. We cannot know what the act of placing particular objects in the water was intended to accomplish. But we can know that it was intentional. We can know that the people who did it were people for whom the distinction between the practical and the symbolic was not necessarily as sharp as it is in the modern world. People for whom catching fish and marking the significance of the fishing place with meaningful deposits were not necessarily separate categories of action. That integration of the practical and the symbolic is one of the things that characterizes human engagement with the world across every documented cultural tradition. The line between work and ritual, between the useful and the meaningful, is never as clear in practice as it is in analytical categories. The people who built the Chalkfield platform were doing something that was at the same time architectural and astronomical and presumably ceremonial or symbolic. The people who arranged the stones on the Welsh headland were at the same time fixing their observational position for astronomical tracking and marking the place as a place of significance. The people who placed objects in the Somerset wetland alongside their fish weir were at the same time exploiting an aquatic resource and engaging in some practice that connected the exploitation to a larger framework of meaning. That larger framework is what we have lost. The specific content of the Mesolithic symbolic world of Britain is not recoverable from the material evidence alone. We can see the expressions of it, the fitted stones and the arranged stones and the carved antler and the wetland deposits. But the framework that gave those expressions their specific meaning, the stories and the beliefs and the social structures and the ritual practices that connected the material expressions to a coherent worldview, is gone. Lost in the enormous span of time and the near-total absence of durable organic material and the complete absence of any written record, what is not lost is the fact of the framework. The material evidence proves that the framework existed. The Chalkfield site and the Lynn headland arrangements and the Somerset wetland deposits and the Cumbrian modified outcrops all prove that the people of Mesolithic Britain inhabited a symbolic world as well as a physical one. That they engaged with their landscape in ways that were structured by meaning as well as by practical need. That they were, in the terminology of the anthropological tradition, fully cultural beings as well as biological ones. That is the proof that the evidence is providing. And that proof is changing the way the discipline understands the Mesolithic and the way it will eventually present the Mesolithic to students and to the general public, and the way the general public will come to understand its own deep history. The change is slow. The change requires the publication of the Chalkfield site and the full analysis of the Somerset deposits and the completion of the Welsh Headland Survey report and the continuing excavation and dating of the Cumbrian modified outcrops and all the other pieces of the increasingly comprehensive picture. But the change is happening, and you know about it. You are part of the audience for the change. The awareness is spreading. The understanding is growing, and the people of Mesolithic Britain, who fitted stones into chalk and arranged viewpoints on Welsh headlands and placed objects in Somerset water and carved marks on antler in the dark of the Great Wildwood, are being more fully and more accurately recognized for what the evidence shows they were. They deserve that recognition. They have been waiting for it for a very long time, longer, by a large margin, than any of the other people whose stories are told in the conventional account of British history. They were here first. They made the first human marks on the British landscape. They established the first human relationships with the specific places that would continue to be significant for thousands of years. They were the beginning, and they were not simple. They were not primitive. They were not waiting to be improved by the arrival of something more advanced. They were themselves, fully and richly and completely themselves, in the ways that the evidence is beginning to reveal. That is the finding. That is what the Chalkfield site means when you place it in the context of everything else the Mesolithic evidence is beginning to show. The beginning of the British human story is earlier and more complex and more fully human than the conventional account has allowed. The account is being revised. The evidence is demanding it. The researchers are providing it. And tonight, you know it. Good night. The Somerset levels are quiet under the night sky. The Chalkfield is patient in the south. The Highland Island is dark above the loch. And the deep beginning of the British human story is more remarkable than anyone knew. Sleep well. There is a moment in any serious investigation when the weight of the evidence shifts from suggestive to compelling. When the various lines of inquiry, the stratigraphy and the radiocarbon dates and the comparative analysis and the environmental reconstruction all converge on the same conclusion, with a force that makes the conclusion no longer deniable in good faith. The Chalkfield site reached that moment somewhere in the third year of the investigation. The researchers know the exact meeting when it happened, the presentation of the final confirmation dates from the second laboratory, the cross-check that removed the last plausible alternative explanation. They remember the quality of the silence in the room after the results were shown. It was not a triumphant silence. It was the silence of people who understood what they were now holding. The full weight of a finding that was going to require explanation and defense and institutional navigation before it could enter the public record in the form it deserved. The silence of people who knew they were right, and who also knew that being right was not going to be simple. That is the character of genuinely significant archaeological discovery. It is not the moment of finding that defines it. The moment of finding is often undramatic, a drainage trench in a field, a contractor's machine encountering stone at unexpected depth. It is the slow, careful, contested process of understanding that defines the significance. And it is that process, as much as the discovery itself, that the Chalkfield site will eventually be remembered for. The process has been exemplary. The researchers have done everything right. They have been cautious where caution was warranted and confident where confidence was earned. They have sought every possible independent confirmation. They have engaged with the most rigorous critics they could find and addressed the criticisms they received. They have built the case as carefully as anyone could build it, and when the publication appears, it will stand. It will stand not because it is comfortable or convenient or welcome to the mainstream of the discipline. It will stand because the evidence is what it is, because the fitted stones are fitted and shaped, and of a type that was transported from a distance, because the orientation is what it is, aligned to the summer solstice to a precision that is not achievable by chance, because the dates are what they are, confirmed by multiple methods and multiple laboratories, placing the construction horizon in the Mesolithic with a confidence that is greater than the dating precision of many Neolithic monuments. Because the carved antler object is what it is, a formally elaborated symbolic object from a period that the conventional account says should not contain such things, because the evidence is what it is. That is the basis on which the case stands. Not interpretation, not speculation, not the enthusiasm of researchers who have become too invested in their findings. Evidence. Physical, datable, analyzable, independently verifiable evidence. The kind that scientific inquiry is designed to produce, and the kind that, however reluctantly, the scientific community eventually accepts. The acceptance will come. It will not come all at once. It will come in stages, as the various components of the publication are absorbed and tested, and the community of researchers with the relevant expertise works through the implications. Some of that working through will be collaborative and constructive. Some of it will be adversarial in the way that genuine scientific debates sometimes are. But all of it will be contributing to the process of integration, of incorporating the Chalkfield site into the understanding that the discipline has of the Mesolithic and of the relationship between the Mesolithic and what came after. The integration will take years. The full impact of the Chalkfield site on the way British prehistory is understood and taught will take longer, but the direction of the impact is clear. The story of who has been in this island, and for how long, and in what ways, is going to be told differently after the Chalkfield site takes its place in the public record. Different, in the direction of deeper, older, more complex, more fully human. In the direction of recognizing the people at the beginning of the British human story as what the evidence shows they were, rather than what the conventional narrative needed them to be. That is the direction all genuine historical revision moves, when the evidence is strong enough to compel it, toward the reality, toward the complexity, toward the recognition of what was actually there, rather than what the frameworks of our own time and our own assumptions found it convenient to believe was there. The Chalkfield site is compelling the revision. The Lunin Headland Survey is contributing to it. The Somerset wetland deposits are contributing to it. The Cumbrian modified outcrops are contributing to it. The ancient DNA evidence from British Mesolithic individuals is contributing to it. All of these converging lines of evidence are building the revised picture, slowly and from different directions, each adding a dimension that the others alone could not provide. The picture that is emerging is not complete. It will not be complete in any of our lifetimes. The Mesolithic period of Britain spans approximately 6,000 years, and the evidence available for those 6,000 years is still very sparse compared to what the subsequent periods have provided. The Chalkfield site is a brilliant point of light in a landscape that is still largely dark. It illuminates a small area with great precision, but does not by itself light up the whole scene. Lighting up the whole scene will require many more Chalkfield sites, found and investigated with the same rigor, many more Somerset wetland surveys, many more Lun headland studies, many more targeted investigations of locations where the combination of geology and chance and careful survey has preserved the evidence that the conventional account did not know to look for. That will take decades. It will take funding. It will take the institutional will that comes from the recognition that the question is important enough to invest in seriously. And that institutional will is, in large part, what the chalk field publication will generate. Publication is the lever. The evidence, once publicly available, will become the argument for more evidence. The chalk field site, once in the record, will be the justification for the research program that will find the other chalk field sites. The carved antler object, once published and analyzed, will be the standard against which other candidate symbolic objects from the period will be evaluated. The dating methods and excavation strategies and analytical approaches that the chalk field investigation has developed will be the toolkit that the follow-up work will use. The system is working as it is supposed to work. A significant discovery generates the evidence for more investment. The more investment generates more discoveries. The more discoveries build the picture. The building picture changes the understanding. The changed understanding leads to even better questions and even more targeted investigation. This is the process. It is slow, it is expensive, it is contested at every stage. But it is the process that produces genuine knowledge. Knowledge that is earned by evidence rather than asserted by authority. Knowledge that survives the challenge of rigorous scrutiny rather than merely the deference of people who are not in a position to argue. The Chalkfield site will contribute to that process in ways that are already being felt in the conversations happening in the specialist community, and that will be felt more broadly when the publication appears. Those effects will compound over the years and decades as the follow-up work builds on the Chalkfield foundation, and somewhere in the chalk of southern England, the fitted stones will remain, patient, in their positions, aligned to a solstice that comes and goes above them every year without stopping to notice that the people who aligned the structure to it are long gone, and that new people, with entirely different tools and entirely different assumptions, are finally beginning to understand what was done here and why. The solstice does not notice. The sun rises where it rises. The shadow falls where it falls. The alignment is as true as it was when the stones were placed. That constancy is one of the most remarkable aspects of astronomical alignment in ancient structures. The sun has not changed its path in any way relevant to the alignments that were built to track it. The summer solstice sunrise happens in the same direction today as it did when the Mesolithic builders of the chalk field oriented their approach feature toward it. Time has passed, an enormous span of time, and the sky has continued to turn in the same patterns, and the alignment is still true. That constancy is the deepest kind of continuity in the chalk field site. The stones and the bones and the ash and the carved object are all that survive of the human investment in the place. The traditions and the stories and the names are gone, the language is gone, the social structures and the beliefs and the specific ceremonial practices are gone, but the sky is still there. The sun still rises in the direction the approach feature points. The alignment is still functional, in the sense that anyone standing at the base of the approach feature on the morning of the summer solstice will still see the sun rise in the direction the feature indicates. That functionality is the surviving connection, not the cultural connection which is severed, the physical connection which the constancy of astronomical mechanics maintains across all the time that culture and biology and language have changed beyond recognition. The sun rises where it rises. The stones point where they point, and the connection between those two facts is as true today as it was when it was first established. That is the final thing to carry into sleep. The constancy, the unchanging accuracy of the alignment, the way that the most ancient human act at the chalk field site, the decision to align the approach feature to the summer solstice sunrise, is still as true as it was when it was made. Some things do not change. The sky does not change, in any way relevant to human purposes. The stones do not change, unless the frost heave tilts them or the excavator disturbs them. And the relationship between the stones and the sky, established by someone 8 or more thousand years ago, with care and skill and intention, is maintained by the simple constancy of both. We are in that relationship now, as surely as the people who built it were. We are under the same sky. The sun will rise tomorrow in the same direction it rose on that Mesolithic summer solstice when the approach was first laid out. The alignment is still true, and we are, at last, beginning to understand it. Good night. The sky is patient. The stones are patient. The alignment is still true. Sleep in the constancy of the sky. The chalk field site is real. The evidence is real. The understanding is coming. Rest now. The summer solstice will come again, as it always does. The sun will rise in the direction the stones indicate, as it always has. Some things do not change. Good night. The particular quality of the British relationship with its prehistoric landscape is something that visitors from other countries often remark on. It is a quality of easy coexistence. Farms in Britain routinely incorporate prehistoric earthworks. The earthwork is simply there. The field goes around it, the hedgerow follows its bank, and the farmer ploughs to the edge of the scheduled monument area and leaves the rest. This is partly a matter of legal protection and partly a matter of long cultural familiarity. The British landscape is so thoroughly dotted with prehistoric features, the barrows and henges and field systems and hill forts and ring ditches, that they have simply become part of the background of what the landscape is. Not something remarkable, something expected. That familiarity has its costs. The ubiquity of prehistoric features in the British landscape has, paradoxically, sometimes made them harder to see, as remarkable rather than easier. When the remarkable is everywhere, it becomes ordinary. The round barrows on every second chalk hilltop, the causewayed enclosure visible from the motorway, the henge monument in the field next to the supermarket, these are things that British people have grown up with and that they have absorbed as fixtures of the landscape rather than as the extraordinary records of the deep human past that they actually are. The chalk field site, if it delivers on its potential when it is published, may do something to disturb that familiarity. Not because it is more spectacular than the existing familiar monuments. It is not, at least not in the visual sense. A level stone surface under a chalk field is not going to produce the kind of immediate visual impact that Stonehenge or Avebury or Silbury Hill produces. But because of what it implies about those existing familiar monuments, because it implies that they are not the beginning of the story, that the story was already underway, already expressing itself in stone and solstice alignment and symbolic objects, before the first Neolithic farmer broke the first ground for the first long barrow. That implication should change how the existing monuments are understood, not the specific meaning or function of any particular monument, but the temporal depth of the tradition within which they were produced. Stonehenge is not the product of a Neolithic culture that invented the engagement with stone and sky from scratch. It is the product of a culture that inherited, from the people who came before them, a long tradition of attending to those relationships and expressing that attendance in stone. The specific forms changed. The specific stone types changed. The scale changed. But the impulse was continuous, and the chalkfield site is the evidence that the continuity goes back further than the Neolithic. The existing monuments deserve that deeper context. They deserve to be understood as expressions of a tradition that is older than they are, rather than as the beginnings of a tradition that they originated. And the chalkfield site is what provides that context, or rather, what begins to provide it, because the full context will require more sites and more dates, and the full research program that the chalkfield publication will motivate. The British landscape, seen in that context, is a landscape in which human investment has been continuous for much longer than the familiar monuments suggest. The familiar monuments are not the beginning. They are a moment, admittedly a spectacular moment, in a much longer human engagement with this specific piece of the earth. That longer engagement is what the chalkfield site represents, the very long view of what it means to be human in this island. Not just the Neolithic view, which begins roughly 4,000 years before the Common Era, not just the Mesolithic view, which begins roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era, the whole view. From the first moment that anatomically modern humans were in Britain, from the first Aurignacian people who arrived in this island when it was still connected to the continent and the great beasts of the Ice Age still roamed, to the present moment, the British landscape has been a landscape in which human beings have been finding things significant and expressing that significance in whatever durable material was to hand. The chalkfield site is one moment in that enormous span of continuous human presence and human engagement. A moment that was not previously known because the evidence for it had not been found and dated and properly understood. But now it is known, at least by the small community of specialists and their close collaborators who have been part of the investigation. And soon, when the publication appears, it will be known more widely, and the knowledge will change something. It will add depth to the picture. It will extend the story backward. It will give the familiar monuments their proper historical context, the context of a tradition older than they are, a tradition that was already expressing human engagement with sky and stone in ways that they built on rather than originated. That is the gift that the Chalkfield site is going to give to the understanding of British prehistory. The gift of depth, of appropriate temporal humility, of the recognition that the story is longer than we thought and that the people at its beginning were more fully human than we have acknowledged. The gift is coming. When it arrives, it will be received by everyone who cares about the deep human story of this island, which is a considerable number of people. The British public has a genuine and sustained interest in its prehistoric past. The visitor numbers at Stonehenge and Avebury and the other great prehistoric monuments are evidence of that. There is an appetite for this kind of history. An appetite for the sense of connection to the deep past that standing in a significant prehistoric landscape can provide. The Chalkfield site will feed that appetite. Not immediately, because it will not be open to visitors in the way that Stonehenge is. It is a working farm. The excavation is a research project, not a visitor attraction. But the knowledge of it, once it is public, will feed the appetite for depth and connection that drives the interest in British prehistory. And the knowledge is coming. The publication is coming. The depth is already there, in the chalk, confirmed by the dates and the analysis and the careful work of the researchers who have devoted years to understanding it. Sleep now in the knowledge of that depth. The British landscape is deeper than it looks. The chalk is white under the night sky, and the fitted stones are in their positions beneath it. The carved antler object is in the laboratory. The solstice alignment is as true as it has always been. And somewhere, in the long human story of this island, a night like this one, 8,000 years or more ago, someone looked up at the same stars and found them worth attending to. We are still attending. Good night. The chalk is patient. The night is long. Sleep well. The Orkney Islands sit off the northern tip of Scotland in the cold grey-green water of the Pentland Firth, and they are, in proportion to their size and their remoteness and their small current population, among the most archaeologically rich places on Earth. The density of prehistoric monuments on Orkney is remarkable even by British standards, which are themselves remarkable by world standards. The Ring of Brodgar, the Standing Stones of Stenness, the Ness of Brodgar Complex, currently being excavated and revealing what appears to be a Neolithic ceremonial complex of extraordinary scale and sophistication. The Dwarfy Stane, a rock-cut tomb of a type found almost nowhere else in Britain, Skara Brae, the Neolithic village whose preservation is so complete that the stone furniture is still in place. These are the things Orkney is known for in the world of British prehistoric archaeology. They represent the Neolithic, and they represent it at its most developed and most impressive. Orkney was not a peripheral backwater in the Neolithic. It was, the evidence increasingly suggests, a central node in a network of ritual and ceremonial exchange that stretched across the British Isles and perhaps further. The grooved ware pottery tradition, one of the distinctive ceramic styles of the later British Neolithic, appears to have originated in Orkney and spread southward to sites including Stonehenge. The stones used in the early phases of Stonehenge came from Wales, not from Orkney, but the cultural connections between the Orcadian ceremonial complex and the southern monument tradition may have been real and significant. Orkney, in the Neolithic, was a place of importance, a place where things were developed that shaped British prehistory across a large geographic area. And the question of what Orkney was before the Neolithic, what the islands were like in the Mesolithic, and whether there were people in them, and what those people were doing, is a question that has been given less attention than it deserves. The question is harder to answer in Orkney than in many other parts of Britain, because the sea level changes that followed the melting of the ice sheets at the end of the last glacial period have submerged much of the coastal landscape where Mesolithic evidence would be expected to survive. The shorelines of 8 or 10 or 12,000 years ago are now underwater, and the coastal camps and fishing stations and shoreline features that Mesolithic communities typically left behind are therefore largely inaccessible. This is a problem that affects Mesolithic archaeology everywhere in Britain, but it is more acute in a small island group like Orkney, where the proportion of the relevant landscape that is now submerged is especially high. What remains above water, and what the Orcadian peat sequences and loch sediments have preserved, has been the subject of a research program that has been running for several years and that has produced results that have not yet received the attention they deserve. The program has been led by a researcher from a Scottish university with expertise in both Mesolithic archaeology and Quaternary environmental change, and its primary focus has been on documenting the evidence for human presence in Orkney before the Neolithic. That evidence, as the program has progressively assembled it, is earlier than most researchers expected. Not, in the end, surprisingly early in absolute terms. The Mesolithic colonization of Orkney probably began sometime in the 7th or 8th millennium before the Common Era, which is within the range that the environmental evidence for the habitability of the islands would predict. But what is earlier than expected, or rather more sophisticated than expected given the conventional picture of Mesolithic behavior, is the nature of the evidence from those early periods of occupation. The Orcadian evidence includes stone tool assemblages that are consistent with the established Mesolithic tradition. It includes hearth features and food refuse deposits that are the standard markers of Mesolithic campsite use. But it also includes something that the conventional picture of Mesolithic behavior in northern Britain does not account for, which is evidence for the modification of natural stone features in ways that seem to go beyond the purely practical. Stone outcrops on several of the main islands show what the researcher has described, carefully and with appropriate hedging, as possible intentional alteration of the natural surface in ways that are consistent with the kinds of modified outcrops documented in the Lake District by the Cumbrian program. The Orcadian evidence is less well preserved than the Cumbrian evidence, and the dating is less precise, partly because the peat environments that surround the outcrops are complex and prone to the kind of stratigraphy mixing that makes interpretation difficult. But the pattern of the modifications, in the specific cases where the researcher is most confident, is consistent with deliberate alteration rather than natural weathering, and the cultural material in the soil contexts associated with the modified features is of Mesolithic character. If Mesolithic people in Orkney were modifying stone outcrops in ways similar to those documented in the Lake District, then the practice was not local to the Cumbrian uplands. It was distributed across a much larger geographic area of northern Britain. And a practice that was distributed across a large geographic area is a practice that was transmitted, that was shared between communities over distances that required some form of connection, some form of communication between people in different locations. The nature of that communication, in the Mesolithic period before farming and before the social structures that farming supported, is one of the most interesting questions in the study of the period. The conventional model of Mesolithic social organization emphasizes the small band as the primary unit, with connections between bands maintained through kinship networks and seasonal aggregation at resource-rich locations. Long-distance communication of cultural practices, in this model, happens through the slow diffusion of ideas along networks of interacting groups, rather than through any more formal or deliberate mechanism of transmission. But the modified outcrop practices in Orkney and the Lake District, if they are indeed related, represent a degree of cultural consistency across several hundred kilometers that seems to require something more than slow diffusion along casual kinship networks. Something more like a deliberate practice, maintained with enough fidelity to produce recognizably similar results in very different geological and environmental contexts. Something that was intentionally transmitted rather than accidentally diffused. The same question arises in connection with the chalk field site. The tradition of fitted stone construction that the chalk field site represents was already established when the site was built. Established where, and transmitted how, are questions the evidence cannot currently answer, but they are questions that the evidence demands be asked. And the fact that similar questions arise in connection with the Cumbrian outcrops and the Orcadian features and the Lynn headland arrangements suggests that what we are beginning to glimpse is not a collection of separate local behaviors, but a cultural landscape of the Mesolithic that was more widely connected and more consistently shared across geographic distance than the conventional model has allowed. A connected Mesolithic Britain. A British Mesolithic in which specific practices and perhaps specific beliefs and specific ways of relating to the landscape were shared across hundreds of kilometers by communities that were in contact with each other through mechanisms we do not yet fully understand. That is what the accumulating evidence is beginning to suggest. It is not a surprising suggestion, in principle. We know that the Neolithic communities of Britain were connected in exactly this way, that grooved ware pottery and specific monument types and specific ritual practices spread across the islands in ways that imply active networks of communication and exchange. We know that later periods saw even more extensive connectivity. Why should the Mesolithic be different, fundamentally, from those later periods in having regional networks of connected communities that shared practices across geographic distance? The answer, in the conventional model, is that the Mesolithic is different because it is pre-agricultural. The conventional model treats agriculture as the enabling condition for the kinds of social complexity and long-distance connectivity that produce shared material culture across large areas. Before agriculture, in this model, the social units were too small and too mobile, and too focused on subsistence, needs to support the kind of sustained long-distance relationships that produce cultural coherence across hundreds of kilometers. The evidence is challenging that model. The Chalkfield site challenges it by showing that Mesolithic communities in Britain were investing in permanent places in ways that imply a degree of social organization beyond the small mobile band. The modified outcrops challenge it by showing that specific practices were maintained with cultural consistency across large geographic areas. The Somerset deposits challenge it by showing that symbolic behavior was integrated with practical subsistence activities in ways that imply a rich and organized symbolic world. The model is being challenged from multiple directions by multiple kinds of evidence. The model is going to have to change. Not immediately, not without contest, but change. The change, when it comes, will be the latest in a long series of revisions to the conventional picture of the Mesolithic that have been accumulating since the discipline first began to take the period seriously as more than a prelude to the Neolithic. Each revision has moved in the direction of greater complexity, greater sophistication, greater recognition of the fully human character of Mesolithic communities. The Chalkfield site is the next step in that direction. A large step. Perhaps the largest yet in the British context, but not the last. The last step has not been taken yet. There are more sites to find, more dates to obtain, more analyses to complete, more arguments to have, more revisions to make. The story of Mesolithic Britain is not finished being told. It is, in a real sense, just beginning to be told properly. That beginning is what the Chalkfield site represents. Not an ending. Not the final word. The beginning of a new and better account of who has been in this island, and for how long, and in what ways, since the end of the last ice age. The account is beginning. The evidence is accumulating. The understanding is growing. Sleep in that beginning. In the awareness that something important is being uncovered, slowly and carefully, and with the full rigor of good science, in the chalk of southern England, and the peat of the Somerset levels, and the fell sides of the Lake District, and the headlands of the Lune Peninsula, and the islands of the Northern Sea. The long British story is longer than we knew. The people at its beginning are more fully human than we have acknowledged. The landscape they inhabited and marked and invested with meaning is deeper and richer and more historically layered than the conventional account has prepared us to understand. And we are beginning, at last, to understand it properly. Good night. The chalk is patient. The peat is patient. The fell sides and the headlands and the northern islands are patient. The understanding is coming, slowly, in the way that true understanding always comes. Sleep well. The last thing about the Chalkfield site, the thing that the researchers have mentioned only in the most private and personal conversations, and that will not appear in the formal publication, because it is not the kind of thing that formal publications include, is the quality of the silence at the site itself. The quality of the silence when you are standing in the excavated trench, looking at the fitted stones, understanding what you are looking at. Researchers have described it in different terms. One used the word weight, another used the word presence. One simply said that it was unlike any other site she had excavated, and she had excavated dozens, and she could not fully articulate why. But they all describe some version of the same thing, which is a quality of the place that is not reducible to the archaeology alone. a quality that the archaeology opens onto rather than explains. This is not a supernatural claim. It is not a claim about ghosts or energies or any of the categories that popular culture uses to describe the unexplained qualities of old places. It is a more modest claim and a more interesting one. It is a claim about what happens when you stand in a place that has been significant for a very long time and you know it and you are paying attention to that knowledge. The significance is not independent of your knowledge and your attention, but it is not entirely constructed by them either. Something is there, something that the place has accumulated through the long sequence of human investment and human attention that the archaeology documents. That something is not the kind of thing that goes in a report. It is not measurable or datable or analyzable with the standard toolkit of archaeological method, but it is part of the experience of the site. Part of what draws the researchers back, season after season, to continue the work in a place that is objectively not comfortable and not convenient and not well compensated. Part of what has kept the question alive in the informal research community and now in the formal investigation through all the years of inadequate resources and institutional resistance and the slow, grinding frustration of building a case that the institutions were not yet ready to receive. The place is part of it. The chalk field, with its two low hills and its fitted stones and its chalk bowl that holds the silence in a particular way, is part of what has sustained the work. Not because anyone would admit that in a grant application, but because place has an effect on people who are paying attention to it, and the people who have been paying attention to this place have felt that effect, and it has been part of what has kept them going. That is the human dimension of the archaeological enterprise that formal publications do not capture. The relationship between the researchers and the site. The way that the place enters the lives of the people who investigate it, quietly and over time, becoming part of how they think and what they care about in ways that they did not choose and cannot always explain. The way that the chalk field has made its researchers into its advocates in ways that go beyond professional commitment. The Mesolithic people who built the chalkfield site were advocates for it in a much more literal sense. They built it. They invested their labor and their skill and their knowledge in it. They returned to it, seasonally or when the occasion required, and maintained its significance with whatever practices belonging to that maintenance. They cared about it in the most direct and material way possible. They chose it and invested in it and kept coming back to it. That relationship between people and place, that investment and return and maintenance, is the most basic structure of human cultural geography. It is older than farming. It is older than any of the technologies and social forms that we use to define historical periods. It is as old as the impulse to find a place significant and to express that significance in durable material, which, the chalkfield site tells us, is very old indeed. The place and the people who cared about it are separated now by a span of time that is not easily imaginable. But the stones are still there. The place is still the place. The two hills are still the sisters, whatever name the people who first noticed them used. The chalk is still white under the night sky, and the summer solstice still rises in exactly the direction that the fitted stones indicated when they were placed. Some things persist, some things do not change, and the connection between the people who attended to those things, then and now, is as real as any connection across time can be. Good night. Sleep in that connection. The chalk field is real. The stones are real. The solstice is real. And the people who found all of it worth attending to, on both ends of the 8,000-year span, are real. That is the whole story for tonight. Rest now. The chalk is patient. The stars are turning. The morning will come, as it always does, from the direction the stones have always indicated. Good night. The Pennine uplands that form the spine of northern England are a landscape of millstone grit and heather moorland and thin acid peat, and they have been walked for a very long time by people who needed to cross from one side of the country to the other. The high passes of the Pennines, the gaps in the long ridge where the watershed is lowest and the crossing is least brutal, were the routes that prehistoric travellers used, and that drovers used, and that traders used, and that eventually became the roads that industrial-era towns grew along. The passes are old. The paths through them are older than any record of their use. On the eastern flanks of the Pennines, where the moorland falls away toward the Vale of York, There is an area of high ground that has been the subject of systematic archaeological survey over the past 2 decades. The survey has been conducted partly by professional archaeologists from a northern university and partly by a voluntary archaeology group whose members have walked every accessible area of the moorland systematically and recorded everything they have found. The combination of professional method and voluntary effort has produced a dataset of extraordinary density for an upland landscape, a record of surface features and finds that is more comprehensive than anything that has previously existed for this area. Within that dataset, there is a cluster of features that the survey team has separated from the main body of the record for special attention. The cluster is located on a broad shelf of moorland at approximately 400 meters elevation, facing south and east, with an unobstructed view of the Vale of York and on clear days of the distinctive profile of the North Yorkshire moors on the far side of the Vale. The features in the cluster are not dramatic. They are not the kind of thing that would attract attention without the benefit of systematic survey and comparative analysis. But in the context of everything that the systematic survey has documented across the rest of the moorland, they are distinctive. They are distinctive because of their relationship to each other and to the terrain. The moorland is full of natural stones, displaced by frost heave and exposed by peat erosion and moved by the various mechanical processes that operate on upland landscapes. The vast majority of these stones are in positions that are consistent with natural displacement. Their arrangements, such as they are, reflect the random outcomes of physical processes over long time periods. But in the cluster, on the south-facing shelf, a subset of the stones show a pattern of spatial relationship that the survey team has subjected to statistical analysis and found to be significantly inconsistent with random distribution. Statistical analysis of stone distributions is a methodological approach that has been used in the study of stone circles and similar features to distinguish deliberate arrangement from natural accumulation. It is not without its critics, who point out the difficulties of establishing appropriate null hypotheses and the dangers of seeing patterns in distributions that are actually the product of complex natural processes. The survey team is aware of these criticisms. They have applied the methodology with appropriate caution, and they have explicitly acknowledged its limitations in the summary they have circulated within the specialist community. With those limitations acknowledged, the result is that the spatial distribution of the stones in the Pennine cluster is statistically more ordered than would be expected from the natural processes that govern stone displacement in this upland environment. The stones in the cluster are not randomly distributed. They show a degree of spatial organization that the analysis finds is more consistent with deliberate arrangement than with the output of natural processes. The dating of the Pennine cluster is less precise than the dating of the Chalkfield site because the upland peat context does not offer the same preservation of datable organic material that the Chalkfield environment provides. The cultural material associated with the cluster is sparse and ambiguous, but what there is, in the form of worked lithics recovered from the soil contexts immediately adjacent to some of the stones, is consistent with a Mesolithic or early Neolithic cultural attribution. Nothing later. Nothing that suggests the arrangement is from any period after the early prehistoric. The Pennine cluster is not the Chalkfield site. The evidence is less robust. The interpretation is more tentative. But in the context of the Chalkfield site and the other evidence for deliberate stone placement and landscape modification in the Mesolithic of Britain, the Pennine cluster is worth noting. It is worth noting because it contributes to the picture of a British Mesolithic in which landscape modification was more widespread and more varied than previously understood. Not just in the chalk of the south, not just in the Lake District, not just on the coastal headlands of Wales and the islands of the Northern Sea, in the upland Pennines too. Every addition to the picture matters. Every documented instance of deliberate stone arrangement or landscape modification from a Mesolithic context is another data point that contributes to the statistical and evidential case for the broader interpretation. And the broader interpretation, when it is fully assembled and properly published, will be the most significant revision of the conventional picture of Mesolithic Britain since the period was first systematically studied. That revision is coming. The Chalkfield site is its most dramatic single piece of evidence. But it is not the only piece. The Pennine Cluster and the Cumbrian modified outcrops and the Lynn headland arrangements and the Somerset wetland deposits and the Orcadian evidence and all the other threads of the accumulating case are all part of the same revision, all pointing in the same direction, all telling the same story. The story of a Mesolithic Britain that was more complex, more connected, more invested in the landscape, more symbolically rich, and more fully engaged with the human project of finding the world meaningful than the conventional account has allowed. The account is being revised, the revision is in progress, and the people who are doing the work of revising it, in field seasons and in laboratories, and in the writing of papers and the compiling of databases, and all the other unglamorous activities that constitute the actual practice of archaeological research, are doing some of the most important work that is being done in the recovery of the deep human past. The deep human past rewards the people who attend to it seriously, not always with funding or recognition or professional advancement, but with something that those things cannot provide, which is the experience of genuine contact with the human story at its deepest available level. The experience of standing in the chalk trench and seeing the fitted stones, of holding the carved antler object and knowing that you are the first person to hold it in 8,000 years, of looking at the statistical pattern in the Pennine distribution and recognizing that the pattern is real and that someone made it. Those experiences are what sustain the work, what make it worth doing beyond the formal rewards. And they are experiences that, in a mediated and indirect form, can be shared with anyone who takes the time to understand what is being found and what it means. You have taken that time tonight. The experience is mediated and indirect, but it is not nothing. The knowledge of what is in the chalk field, the awareness of the carved antler object in its laboratory, the understanding of what the statistical pattern in the Pennines might mean, these are things you now carry that you did not carry before. They are small additions to your understanding of the world. But small additions to genuine understanding accumulate in the same way that small additions to scientific knowledge accumulate. They become, over time, the difference between a more complete and a less complete picture of reality. Your picture of British prehistory is more complete now than it was when this began. Not complete in any final sense. Nothing is ever complete in that sense, but more complete, pointing in the direction of the revision that is coming. Aware of the depth that is being recovered, that awareness is a form of participation in the recovery. Not active participation, not the kind that requires a spade or a laboratory or a statistical software package. But passive participation, the receiving of what the evidence is beginning to transmit, the holding of the question that the evidence raises, the caring about the answer that the question demands. Caring is not nothing. Caring is what creates the cultural and political environment in which serious investigation is funded and valued and continued. Caring is what turns the evidence into understanding and the understanding into change. Without the caring of enough people, the investigation stalls. With it, the investigation continues, however slowly, toward the answers that the evidence is beginning to make possible. You care. That is what brought you here tonight, to this long and slow telling of the question and its context. The caring that is part of why you find the deep human past worth attending to in the quiet hours. That caring is part of what is keeping the question alive. And the question, alive in enough minds and hearts, will eventually produce the institutional response that the evidence deserves. The funding, the full excavation, the comprehensive publication, the revision of the textbooks and the museum displays, and the educational programs that shape what the general public knows about the deep human story of Britain. It is coming. Slowly. But it is coming. Sleep now. The chalk is patient. The fitted stones are in their positions. The carved antler object is in its laboratory storage. And somewhere in the south of England, under the white chalk, aligned to a summer solstice that will come again in a few months, as it has come every year for as long as the earth has been circling the sun, the patient stones are exactly where the Mesolithic people placed them. They are still doing their work, still indicating the direction of the solstice sunrise, still marking the place as a place that someone found significant enough to invest in. And we are, at last, beginning to understand why. Good night. The chalk is patient. The stars are patient. And the understanding, when it finally arrives, will be worth every year of waiting. Sleep well. The night before the summer solstice in southern England has a particular quality in late June. The sky does not get fully dark. At these latitudes in midsummer, the sky retains a faint luminosity in the north, even at midnight, a twilight that never quite resolves into full darkness. The night is pale, the chalk hills glow, and the northeast horizon, toward which the chalk field approach feature points, brightens early, the grey of pre-dawn arriving before anyone who has not been watching for it expects. In that pale summer night, 8,000 years or more ago, the people who had built the Chalkfield site were perhaps already gathering, coming from wherever their seasonal round had taken them, coming back to the place they had invested in and marked and aligned to this specific morning, coming to be present when the sun appeared above the northeast horizon in the precise direction that the approach feature indicated. We do not know what they did when they got there. We do not know what the solstice sunrise meant in the context of their cosmology and their social practices and their specific beliefs about the relationship between the sun and the world. We do not know whether the gathering was joyful or solemn or both at once, whether there were songs or silence, whether there were specific roles and specific people who performed those roles, whether the occasion was marked with feasting or fasting or offerings or physical practice or something else entirely. We know they came. The evidence of their coming, in the ash and the bone and the carved object in the chalk bowl, is the evidence of repeated presence at the site over an extended period. People came and came again. The place was used. It was used on purpose. And the orientation of the approach to the solstice sunrise is the best evidence we have of at least one of the occasions that brought them. The summer solstice in the northern hemisphere is the longest day. The day when the sun rises at its most northerly point and sets at its most southerly, and the hours of light are at their maximum. In the landscape of the great wildwood that covered much of Britain in the Mesolithic, the solstice would have been experienced differently than it is today. Without the artificial light that flattens the experience of the solar cycle in the modern world, the lengthening and shortening of days would have been keenly felt. The longest day would have been meaningful not abstractly but experientially. Not a calendar date, but a physical reality of warmth and light and the fullness of the summer resources that sustained life. Marking that day, gathering to mark it, building a structure that made the precise moment of the marking legible in permanent form, is a response to that experiential reality that makes complete human sense. It does not require an elaborate cosmological system to motivate it. It requires only the kind of attention to the natural world and the kind of investment in significant places that the Chalkfield site now proves was present in Mesolithic Britain. The attention and the investment were there. The place was there. The solstice came and went above it, year after year, marking the turning of the year in the direction of the structure that the builders had oriented to receive it. And the people, in whatever numbers and whatever organization they possessed, came to be present at that turning, to be there when the sky and the land met in the way that the structure had been built to make visible. That is what the Chalkfield site was, at minimum. Whatever other purposes the platform and the approach and the enclosed chalk bowl served, the solstice orientation tells us that at minimum the site was a place for being present at a specific astronomical moment, a place built to make that presence physically meaningful, to give it architectural form, to make the direction of the rising sun on the longest day of the year legible in fitted stone. 8,000 years later, the fitted stone is still there. The solstice still rises in the same direction, and we are beginning at last to understand what we are looking at. The understanding is the gift of the work. The years of investigation and analysis and argument and peer review that the Chalkfield site has required, the gift is not immediate. It has not been quick. It has taken years of patient effort from researchers who were not sure when they started that the evidence would hold up under scrutiny. It has taken the willingness to commit to a finding that was going to be controversial and to defend it with the rigor that controversy demands. The gift is coming, and you are part of the receiving of it, here at the end of this long telling, in whatever the quiet hours of your particular place are offering tonight. The Chalkfield is real. The investigation is real. The finding is real. And the understanding that it will eventually produce, the revised and deeper and more accurate picture of Mesolithic Britain that the Chalkfield site makes necessary, is real in the sense of being the inevitable destination of the evidence. The evidence leads where it leads. The truth follows the evidence. and the understanding follows the truth. That is the process. That is the long, slow, contested, ultimately necessary process by which the human understanding of the human past moves forward. It is moving forward tonight. In the laboratory where the carved antler object is being analyzed. In the university office where the publication draft is being revised. In the field where the chalk is white under the midsummer sky. And in the minds of the people who have heard this telling and who will carry the question forward into whatever comes next. You are carrying it. The question is alive. The chalk field is real. The 8,000 years between the Mesolithic builders and this moment are real and enormous, and make the connection across them no less real for being so ancient. They built in stone. The stone persisted. The question reached you. That is the transmission. That is the gift. That is the whole of the story. For tonight, sleep now. The chalk is white in the late midsummer twilight of the pale English night. The stones are in their positions. The solstice will come again, as it always does, from the direction the approach feature has always indicated. Good night. The fitted stones are patient. The carved object is waiting to be understood. The understanding is coming, and you are part of what makes it possible. Rest well. There is one more thing to say before the night takes everything into its keeping. It is about the people who have been doing the work, not the Mesolithic builders whose work is in the chalk, but the living people, the researchers and the knowledge keepers and the informal investigators and the indigenous consultants and all the others who have contributed to the slow recovery of the deep British prehistoric past. They are not famous. Their names do not appear in newspapers or on television programs about British history. The institutions they work within have not made them celebrities or household names. They are doing the quiet, patient, unglamorous work of serious investigation in a field that the public finds vaguely interesting but does not closely follow, funded at levels that most people in the modern research economy would consider inadequate for the importance of what is being done. But the work they are doing matters. It matters in the most fundamental sense of contributing to the human understanding of the human story. Every fitted stone properly documented, every radiocarbon date properly obtained and interpreted, every carved object properly analyzed, every site record properly compiled and stored in a form that future researchers can access, is a contribution to a cumulative knowledge that outlasts any individual and that builds toward the complete and honest account of the deep human past that this generation and future generations deserve. The Chalkfield site is the most dramatic current contribution to that cumulative knowledge in British prehistoric archaeology, but it is one contribution among many. It sits within a tradition of serious archaeological inquiry that has been building knowledge about British prehistory for more than 2 centuries. It builds on the work of the people who came before the current researchers. It will be built on by the people who come after them. The chain of knowledge is long. The Chalkfield site is one link. The researchers who have investigated it are one generation of the long sequence of people who have dedicated professional lives to understanding the deep human story of this island. That dedication deserves recognition. Not the recognition of fame or celebrity, the recognition of understanding what the work is and why it matters. The recognition that comes from knowing about the Chalkfield site and knowing what it required to bring it from a drainage contractor's puzzled phone call to the county archaeologist to the peer-reviewed publication that will eventually change the way British prehistory is understood. You know about it now. That knowledge is a form of recognition of the work, a form of participation in the community of people who care about these questions and who sustain, through their caring, the cultural and political environment in which serious investigation can continue. The caring matters. The knowing matters. The connection between the ancient evidence and the living people who attend to it matters. And the connection between the living people who investigate the evidence and the broader audience of people who find the results worth knowing, that connection is what makes the whole enterprise possible and meaningful. You are part of that connection. You have been, for the duration of this telling, attending to something that deserves attention, something that is real and important, and that is slowly, carefully, being brought to the understanding it has always deserved. The Chalkfield site is real. The Mesolithic builders of Britain were real. The 8,000 years between them and us are real and enormous. and the understanding that is coming, the more complete and more honest account of the deep British prehistoric past that the Chalkfield site will help produce, is real in the sense of being the necessary destination of the evidence. The destination is coming. The path to it is long, but the people walking it are serious and dedicated and doing the work that the evidence requires, and the evidence is more than sufficient to justify every step of the walk. Good night. The chalk is patient. The fitted stones are in their positions. The carved antler object is waiting in the laboratory. The summer solstice will come again, as it always does, from the direction the approach feature has always indicated. The work continues. The understanding grows. The deep British story is being recovered. Sleep well. The night is long. The chalk hills are white in the pale summer twilight, and 8,000 years of patient stone are pointing toward the morning. Good night. The chalk has been keeping its secret for a very long time. Longer than the Norman conquest, longer than the Roman occupation, longer than the Celtic Iron Age chieftains who built their hill forts on the heights above the very field where the fitted stones lie, longer than anything that has a name in British history. 8,000 years or more of chalk and silence, and the patient holding of what was placed here by people whose names are gone, and whose language is gone, and whose specific beliefs are gone, but whose work is still in the ground. The ground kept it. The chalk kept it. And now the work of carefully credentialed researchers with radiocarbon dating and OSL and photogrammetry and all the other tools of modern investigation is bringing it back into the light that 8,000 years of soil and chalk and the weight of subsequent history have been keeping it from. That bringing back into the light is the act of historical justice. Not justice in the political sense, though there is something political about who gets to have their history told and in what form and with what degree of attention. Justice in the simple sense of giving what is real its proper due. The Mesolithic builders of the Chalkfield site were real. Their work was real. Their investment in the place was real. Their symbolic life, evidenced by the carved antler object, was real. And giving all of that the serious attention it deserves, the radiocarbon dating and the careful excavation and the rigorous peer review and the eventual publication in the full record of the discipline is the simple justice of taking real things seriously. The justice is being done, slowly and imperfectly, and with inadequate resources, and with the friction of institutional resistance. But it is being done. The evidence is being treated with the seriousness it deserves. The people who left the evidence are being given the recognition that the evidence demands. They did not know they needed that recognition. They were not making the Chalkfield site in anticipation of being recognized by people 8,000 years in the future. They were making it for their own purposes, in their own time, in their own cultural context. The recognition is something we are giving them in the act of attending to what they left. It is a gift that can only go in one direction. We are giving it tonight. In the attending to this story, in the caring about the Chalkfield and the carved antler object and the solstice alignment, and all the evidence that together tells us that the Mesolithic people of Britain were fully human in all the ways that matter. They were. The evidence proves it. And we are, at last, receiving that proof. Good night. The chalk is white. The stars are turning. The morning is coming, from the direction the stones have always indicated. Sleep well. The fitted stones will be there in the morning. The carved antler object will still be in its storage container in the university laboratory. The solstice alignment will still be true, pointing northeast in the direction of a sunrise that has not changed its bearing in any way that the builders of the Chalkfield site would not recognize. Some things are very constant. The astronomical mechanics that determine where the sun rises on the summer solstice are not going to change in any human-relevant time frame. The chalk that preserved the fitted stones is going to continue to be chalk. The OSL dates that place the construction horizon in the Mesolithic are going to remain what they are. The evidence is not going anywhere. The understanding will come to meet it. That is the only thing that is required of us. The willingness to let the understanding be enlarged by the evidence, rather than shrinking the evidence to fit the understanding we arrived with. The Chalkfield site is asking for that willingness. It is not asking for anything else, not for certainty, not for the abandonment of rigorous method, not for the acceptance of things that the evidence does not support, just the willingness to let the evidence lead. to follow it where it goes, even if where it goes is somewhere the existing frameworks did not make room for. It goes to a Mesolithic Britain that was building, that was attending to the sky, that was investing in specific places, that was producing symbolic objects, that was living the full human life in all the ways that the full human life has been lived by people in every period and every place where the evidence is good enough to show it. The evidence is good enough here. The chalk has been kind. The researchers have been careful. The findings are solid. The understanding is coming. Good night. Sleep in the patience of the chalk. The fitted stones are in their positions. The morning will come from the direction they have always indicated. The chalk field is patient. The question is alive. The night is long, and the hills are pale, and the stars are turning above them in the same patterns they have always turned in, above people who were here and then were not here, and who left their work in the stone. For people like us who are here now and attending, we are attending. We have been attending all night. And the attending has been its own kind of gift, given to the people who could not have known we would be here, and to ourselves, who did not know until tonight that what was under the chalk field in the south of England was going to matter to us in the way that it does. It matters. The deep human past matters. The chalk field matters. The carved antler object matters. The summer solstice rising in the direction the approach feature points matters. All of it matters. Good night. Sleep well. The chalk is patient, and the morning is coming. Rest now.